He was the kind of person who made you forget why you ever put walls up in the first place. It didn't start with fireworks or some grand romantic gesture. It was just a quiet, unexpected connection that sneaks up on you when you're least prepared. We met through a mutual friend at a game night, of all things. I wasn't in the mood to socialize, but she insisted. "Just come," she said. "It'll be fun, I promise." I doubted her, but I went, and that's where I met him. We ended up on the same team for some ridiculous trivia game, and from the moment we locked eyes, it felt like we'd known each other for years. He was smart, sarcastic, quick with comebacks that made me laugh in ways I hadn't in a long time. There was no awkwardness, no forced small talk. It was easy, and that scared me more than I'd like to admit. I wasn't looking for anything serious. At least that's what I told myself. But with him, it was hard to stick to that plan. He asked for my number at the end of the night, and before I even made it home, there was a text. "You have the brain of a trivia genius and the heart of someone who doesn't even realize how cool they are. Let me take you to dinner? How do you say no to that?" So I didn't. Our first date was the following week. Pizza at this little place he swore had the best garlic knots in town. Spoiler, they were average at best. But sitting across from him, watching the way he talked with his hands and made silly jokes about the people at the next table, it didn't matter. The night felt perfect, garlic knots and all. And when he walked me to my car and kissed me goodnight, I remember thinking, okay, this might be something real. From there, everything unfolded like the kind of romance you don't expect to happen in real life. He wasn't just charming, he was kind, thoughtful in ways that felt rare. He remembered the things I told him, like how I hated Mondays and loved iced coffee, even in the dead of winter. He'd surprise me with my favorite snacks, send me songs he thought I'd like, and leave little notes for me to find. Today is better because you're in it. It felt good. It felt safe. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd found someone who wasn't going to hurt me. Someone who would stay. And for a while he did. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to shift. It wasn't anything obvious. No fights, no dramatic changes. Just little things. He stopped texting me as often, stopped calling just to say goodnight. Plans that used to feel exciting became things he'd cancel with vague excuses. Work's been crazy. I just need a night to myself. I tried not to overthink it, but the truth is I could feel him slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. I told myself it was just a phase. Relationships aren't supposed to stay perfect forever, right? People get busy. Life gets in the way. But the space between us grew wider, and no matter how hard I tried to close it, he always stayed just out of reach. It felt like trying to hold on to water. No matter how tight I gripped, it slipped through my fingers. Then came the night that everything unraveled. We had plans to go to a friend's party, one of those low-key gatherings where everyone sits around a fire pit, drinking cheap beer and telling stories. I've been looking forward to it all week. But 2 hours before we were supposed to leave, he texted, "Not really feeling it tonight. You go without me." I stared at my phone, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. This was the third time he'd canceled on me in the past 2 weeks. And I knew in that moment that it wasn't about the party. It wasn't about being tired or needing alone time. It was about me. I called him, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. He answered on the third ring, sounding tired. "Hey," he said like nothing was wrong. I took a deep breath. "We need to talk," I whispered. He sighed, one of those heavy, weary sighs that says more than words ever could. "I know," he said quietly. And that's when I knew. I knew it was over, even before he said the words out loud. "I care about you," he began, and I could feel the but coming before it even left his lips. "But I don't think I'm in the right place for this. For us." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why he pursued me in the first place. Why he made me feel safe only to leave when I finally let my guard down. But instead, all I managed was, "Okay." Because what else can you say when someone decides they don't want you anymore? After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the empty street outside my window. I felt numb, like all the emotions had drained out of me, leaving behind nothing but a dull ache. I replayed every moment we'd shared, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But there wasn't a single moment I could point to, just a slow, quiet fade into nothingness. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was losing the version of myself I'd been with him. The version that believed in love again, that thought maybe this time would be different. It felt like getting knocked down after finally learning how to stand on my own 2 feet. And I hated him for that. I hated him for making me hope. For weeks, I carried that anger with me like a shield. I told myself I was done. No more dating, no more opening up, no more letting anyone in. It was easier to be alone, I decided. At least when you're alone, no one can leave you. No one can break your heart. But here's the thing, you can't stay angry forever. Eventually, the anger fades, and all you're left with is the sadness. And that's when the real healing begins. I wish I could say I've moved on completely, that I don't think about him anymore. But the truth is, there are still nights when I lie awake, wondering if he ever thinks about me, if he regrets letting me go, if he misses the way we used to laugh together, the way things felt so easy in the beginning. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is this: I'm still here. I'm still standing, even though it feels like the ground beneath me shifts every time I try to take a step forward. And maybe that's the point. Maybe life isn't about finding someone who makes everything perfect. Maybe it's about learning how to keep walking, even when everything falls apart. So that's what I'm doing. One step at a time, holding on to hope, even when it feels impossible. Because as much as it hurts to fall, it hurts even more to stop believing. And I'm not ready to give up. Not yet. A couple years ago, I was driving home late one night from my girlfriend's place. It was almost 1 a.m., and the roads were empty. Just me, the hum of my engine, and the occasional flicker of streetlights. My usual route took me down a 2-lane highway that cut through miles of farmland and forest. Most nights, it was peaceful, a straight shot with nothing but open road and quiet fields. But that night, something felt wrong. It started with a weird pressure in my chest, like I couldn't take a full breath. At first, I thought it was just fatigue or too much caffeine. But the further I drove, the worse it got, like my whole body was on edge, every instinct telling me to turn around and go back. I tried to shake it off. I mean, what was there to be afraid of? Just an empty road in the middle of nowhere. I was about 10 minutes from home when I noticed the headlights behind me. They were far back at first, just a soft glow on the horizon, but something about them felt off. I don't know why, but my pulse kicked up, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The car behind me was gaining, getting closer and closer, until its high beams filled my mirrors with blinding white light. Okay, chill, I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel. It's probably just some jerk tailgating. I moved into the right lane to let them pass, but they didn't. The car stayed right on my bumper, those high beams burning into the back of my skull. I couldn't see anything, just the glare of the lights flooding my car. My heart started pounding harder. I slowed down, hoping they'd just pass me already, but the car behind me slowed too. Now, I've dealt with bad drivers before, but this didn't feel like road rage. It felt deliberate. I tried speeding up, and so did they. I slowed down, and they matched me, inch for inch, staying just close enough to make my skin crawl. At one point, I thought about pulling over to let them go by, but every bone in my body screamed, "Don't stop." I didn't know why, but I just knew I had to keep moving. We drove like that for miles, the other car glued to my bumper. My hands were shaking, white-knuckling the steering wheel. The road ahead was pitch black, no streetlights, no other cars. Just me and whoever the hell was behind me, playing some twisted game. Then, without warning, the car behind me swerved into the other lane. For a second, I thought they were finally going to pass. But instead, they pulled up right beside me, so close I could have rolled down my window and touched their car. And that's when I saw him. The driver wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me. His face was pale and slack, almost expressionless, but his eyes, God, his eyes were wrong. They were wide, unblinking, and full of something I can only describe as hunger. Not anger, not annoyance, just this deep, gnawing hunger. I stared back, frozen, barely able to keep the car steady on the road. And that's when he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face like his skin didn't quite fit right. His teeth were small, too straight, like they belonged to someone else entirely. It was the kind of smile you see in nightmares, the kind that tells you you're not dealing with something human. I jerked my wheel to the right, almost running off the road, and slammed on the gas. My tires squealed as I sped away, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might explode. For a moment, the car stayed beside me, matching my speed, and I thought, this is it. I'm not getting away. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the other car braked hard, falling back into the darkness. The headlights flickered once and then they were gone. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, white-knuckled and gasping for breath, until I saw the familiar glow of a gas station up ahead. I swerved into the parking lot and threw the car in a park, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The attendant inside gave me a weird look as I stumbled through the door, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around people, somewhere with lights and noise and other cars. I stayed at that gas station for over an hour, pacing the aisles, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, maybe a weird dream I'd fallen into while driving. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to get back in the car and drive the rest of the way home. The road was empty again, the forest on either side silent and still, but every shadow felt sharper. Every flicker in my peripheral vision made my heart skip a beat. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, just staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then I saw it, a single handprint on the outside of the passenger window. It was small, too small to belong to the man I'd seen, and it was smeared, as if someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. And to this day, I still don't take that highway after dark. Because I know, somewhere out there, waiting in the dark, he's still driving. And the next time he pulls up beside someone on that empty road, they might not get away. The night my old friend Ben showed up at my door, I hadn't seen him in almost 5 years. We hadn't ended things on bad terms, not exactly, just one of those slow fades where life pulls you in different directions, and suddenly someone you used to see every day feels like a stranger. It was close to midnight, and I'd already been in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, almost hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure if they were supposed to be there. When I opened the door, there he was, Ben, soaked from the rain, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He gave me a sheepish smile, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "Hey," he said like we just talked yesterday. I blinked at him, still trying to catch up. "Hey." He shifted on his feet, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the porch. "I know it's late. I didn't know where else to go. I should have asked him what the hell he was doing here after all this time. But instead, I stepped aside and said, 'Come in.' Ben nodded, brushing past me with a muttered thanks. His clothes smelled faintly of wet pavement and exhaustion, and he looked around my apartment like he was trying to figure out if I'd changed much since the last time he was here. I hadn't. Same worn couch, same leaning bookshelf I never got around to fixing, same air of barely controlled chaos that had always felt like home to me, but probably looked like a mess to everyone else. Ben kicked off his shoes by the door and gave me that crooked smile I remembered so well, the one that made him look like a kid caught sneaking candy. "You still live like a bachelor?" I snorted, says the guy who showed up unannounced at midnight. He laughed, and just like that, the years between us didn't seem so far apart. I made coffee because neither of us mentioned needing sleep, and we sat on the couch, steam curling between us in the dim light. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "what brings you here?" Ben stared into his cup, swirling the coffee in slow circles. "I left her," he said quietly. It took me a second to realize who he meant, his girlfriend Rachel. They'd been together for years. The last I'd heard, they'd moved in together, even talked about getting married. "Wow," I said, not sure what else to offer. I didn't know things were bad." "Yeah," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Neither did I. Not until they were." He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept his eyes on the swirling coffee, as if it might offer some kind of answer he hadn't figured out yet. We sat there for a while, the silence between us stretching but not uncomfortable. Ben had always been like that, someone you could sit quietly with without feeling the need to fill the space with words. Finally, he let out a long breath and leaned back against the couch. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted. I just got in the car and started driving. And ended up here? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He grinned, though there was something sad around the edges of it. Guess I figured you'd still be around. You always were. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it wasn't not one, either. Ben told me bits and pieces of what had happened. How the fights with Rachel started small but grew louder and more frequent. How they'd both tried to fix things but never seemed to meet in the middle. How one day he woke up and realized he didn't recognize the life they'd built together. I thought love was supposed to feel easier, he said, his voice low. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I had any wisdom to offer. Love, in my experience, was a lot like everything else in life. Messy, unpredictable, and rarely easy. At some point, the rain outside turned into a soft drizzle, tapping gently against the windows. Ben glanced toward the door, as if considering whether to leave, but he didn't move. You can crash here if you want, I said, surprising myself with how easily the offer came out. He gave me a grateful smile. Thanks. I dug out some spare blankets from the closet, tossing them onto the couch. It's not much, but it's perfect, Ben said, cutting me off. He stretched out on the couch, pulling the blanket over himself like he'd done this 100 times before. And maybe in a way he had. In the morning, I woke to the smell of coffee brewing. Ben was in the kitchen, barefoot and shirt rumpled, pouring 2 mugs. Hope you don't mind, he said, handing me a cup. Figured it's the least I could do. I took the mug and leaned against the counter, watching as he stirred sugar into his own coffee. It felt strange, familiar and foreign all at once, like stepping back into a part of my life I'd thought was long gone. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, the morning sun filtering through the windows, casting soft light over the cluttered apartment. For a moment, it felt like we were 21 again, sitting in my dorm room, making plans we'd never follow through on. Ben stayed for 3 days. He never said how long he planned to be there, and I never asked. We fell into an easy rhythm, making coffee in the mornings, going for walks when the weather cleared, sitting on the couch at night watching old movies without really paying attention to them. It was like picking up a book we'd both put down years ago, turning the pages slowly, unsure where the story would take us next. On the 3rd night, we sat on the balcony, beers in hand, watching the city hum below us. You think you'll go back? I asked, not looking at him. Ben was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. I nodded, taking a sip of my beer. Either way, you'll figure it out. He smiled, but it was a small, uncertain thing, like he wasn't quite ready to believe it yet. The next morning, he packed his things without fanfare. There were no grand goodbyes, no promises to stay in touch, just a quick hug and a mumbled thanks for everything before he slipped out the door. I stood by the window, watching as he climbed into his car and drove away, the taillights disappearing around the corner. For a moment, the apartment felt too quiet, too still, like something important had just shifted, and I wasn't sure what to do with the space it left behind. But then the coffee machine beeped, and the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. I poured myself a cup, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared out the window. The sun was just starting to rise, casting soft gold light over the rooftops, and for the first time in a long while I felt okay. Not great, not fixed, but okay. And maybe for now, that was enough. It was supposed to be a simple field trip. You know, one of those end-of-the-year excursions that teachers throw together because they've given up on teaching and just want to get us out of the building for a day. The plan was to visit the local museum, watch a boring science presentation, and be back at school before lunch. Nothing could possibly go wrong, right? Yeah, not with my friend Brandon on board. If I had to describe Brandon in one word, it would be chaotic. He wasn't intentionally a troublemaker. It's just that the universe seemed to bend toward disaster wherever he went. He could trip on flat surfaces. He once locked himself in a locker just to see if it was possible. Spoiler, it was. And on this particular day, Brandon was in rare form. We were supposed to board the buses at 8:30 a.m. sharp, but by 8:32, Brandon had already lost his permission slip. He ran around the parking lot, asking random students if he could borrow theirs, while our teacher, Mr. Thompson, stood there rubbing his temples like he regretted every decision that had brought him to this moment. Eventually, Brandon found his crumpled permission slip in the pocket of his gym shorts. Shorts he hadn't worn in a week, and sprinted onto the bus with a victorious, "Got it." The entire bus cheered for no reason, and Mr. Thompson sighed so deeply it was like his soul left his body for a minute. The ride to the museum was uneventful, except for the fact that Brandon kept trying to convince the bus driver to stop at Taco Bell. "Come on, man," he said, leaning over the driver's shoulder. "We're not technically late yet." When we arrived at the museum, we got the usual boring tour: dinosaur bones, old paintings, weird rock collections. Everyone was half asleep within 15 minutes, except for Brandon, who wandered off at least 3 times and had to be dragged back by Mr. Thompson, who was slowly but visibly unraveling. And then we reached the planetarium. You know, one of those dome theaters where they project constellations on the ceiling and everyone pretends to care about stars. This was the part of the trip we'd been looking forward to because it meant sitting in the dark for 45 minutes and hopefully sneaking in a nap. We filed into the planetarium, took our seats, and waited as the lights dimmed. That's when Brandon turned to me with the kind of grin that could only mean trouble. "Wanna bet I can make it to the projector without getting caught?" "Please, for the love of God, don't." Brandon, of course, took that as a challenge. The thing you need to understand is that Brandon had a gift for sneaking around. He wasn't stealthy in a normal way. He was clumsy, loud, and impossible to miss, but somehow people just didn't notice him. It was like he existed slightly out of phase with reality, where the rules of normal behavior didn't apply. As the narrator droned on about constellations, Brandon slid out of his seat and began crawling toward the giant dome projector in the middle of the room. I watched in horror as he army crawled across the floor, moving with all the grace of a drunk possum. I thought for sure he'd get caught. There was no way he could pull this off. But somehow, against all logic and reason, Brandon made it to the projector. He crouched there, grinning like a madman, and gave me a thumbs up from the shadows. And that's when he did the dumbest thing imaginable. Brandon reached up and pushed a random button on the projector. What followed was pure, unfiltered chaos. The stars on the dome's ceiling exploded. Not literally, but the entire projection went haywire. Constellations spun wildly. Planets zoomed across the sky like pinballs, and the narrator's voice, which had been calm and soothing, suddenly glitched and warped into this demonic, robotic mess. "Alright, is gone knee." The room erupted into chaos. Kids started screaming. Someone thought it was part of the show and yelled, "This is awesome." Mr. Thompson, who had been dozing off in the back row, jumped to his feet and yelled, "What the hell is happening?" Meanwhile, Brandon was still at the projector, frantically pressing buttons like he was trying to defuse a bomb. The stars on the ceiling flashed like a rave, and then, out of nowhere, a giant, glowing image of Saturn zoomed in and stayed there, spinning in place like it was taunting us. I couldn't breathe. I was laughing so hard I thought I was going to pass out. The other students were losing their minds, either freaking out or filming the whole thing for Snapchat. And poor Mr. Thompson was running around in circles, shouting, "Who did this? Who broke the universe?" At that exact moment, Brandon realized he had made a mistake. He tried to crawl back to his seat, but in his panic, he tripped over a cable, yanked the projector halfway off its stand, and sent it spinning like a top. The entire room tilted into madness, stars swirling, planets colliding, the narrator still glitching out with random space facts. "Jupiter is bigger than your own." Brandon managed to crawl back to his seat just as the museum staff stormed in, looking like they were ready to call the SWAT team. Mr. Thompson was so red in the face, I thought he was going to spontaneously combust. "Who was it?" he roared. "Who touched the projector?" The whole class sat in stunned silence. Nobody said a word. And then, in the quietest, most innocent voice imaginable, Brandon whispered, "Must have been the stars." I thought Mr. Thompson was going to die on the spot. The staff shut down the projector, the lights came back on, and we were promptly escorted out of the planetarium. The bus ride back to school was silent, except for Brandon, who sat there eating the candy bar he'd stolen from the museum gift shop, completely unbothered by the destruction he'd caused. The best part? Somehow, nobody ratted him out. To this day, the school has no idea who broke the planetarium projector, And every time we run into Mr. Thompson at the grocery store, we give him a cheerful, "Hey, remember the stars?" He does. Oh, he definitely does. The first time it happened, it felt like slipping on ice. Completely accidental, but the second I hit the ground, I knew there was no stopping it. Jake and I had been friends for almost 10 years at that point. He wasn't just my best friend, he was my person. The one I called when I was too anxious to function. The one who knew exactly how I took my coffee without asking, and the one who'd send me stupid memes at 2 a.m. because he knew I'd still be awake. It happened after one of those long nights we swore we wouldn't have anymore. Just a couple of drinks at the start, which turned into shots, which turned into both of us sitting on my apartment floor, laughing until we cried. Somewhere between the fourth shot and the third hour of talking about nothing, I leaned my head against his shoulder. He didn't move. He just sat there, warm and solid, and suddenly it felt like every shitty thing in my life didn't matter for a little while. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened?" I asked. I didn't plan to say it. The words just slipped out uninvited. Jake gave me this sideways look, half smiling like he thought I was messing with him. "What do you mean?" "You know," I said, feeling braver than I should have. "Us." He stared at me for a beat too long, his expression unreadable. And then, just like that, the space between us disappeared. I kissed him. Or maybe he kissed me. I don't even know. All I know is that 1 second we were sitting there on my floor, and the next, we were tangled together, breathless and desperate, like we'd been waiting for this moment all along. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even graceful. But it felt like everything I hadn't let myself admit I wanted. And for those few minutes, hours, maybe, it didn't matter that this was Jake, my best friend, the one person I couldn't afford to lose. It just felt right. The next morning was a blur. I woke up with his arm draped over me, our legs tangled under the sheets, and for a second, I forgot that anything had changed. But then he stirred, blinked at me with that sleepy, confused expression, and I knew that we'd just stepped over a line we couldn't step back from. "Hey," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Hey," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest. We lay there for a minute, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Jake cleared his throat and smiled, that lazy, crooked smile that had always felt like home to me. "So, last night." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Yeah, last night. Are we okay?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him that everything was fine, that this didn't have to mean anything if he didn't want it to. But the truth was I didn't know. I didn't know what we were, or what we were supposed to do next, or how to pretend that nothing had changed. "We're fine," I lied. He smiled again, and for a second, I let myself believe it. For the first few weeks, we managed to keep things normal, or at least close enough to it that neither of us had to confront what was happening between us. We still hung out all the time, still went on late-night food runs, and crashed on each other's couches, still texted each other 100 times a day. The only difference was every now and then, we'd end up in bed together. It wasn't planned. It never was. It just kept happening. The thing about sleeping with your best friend is that it feels dangerously easy, like slipping into a rhythm you didn't even know you'd been craving. And the worst part? It was never awkward. Not once. Every time felt natural, familiar, like we were just two halves of the same whole, finally finding each other. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I could handle it, that it didn't mean anything, that I didn't want more, that I could keep my heart out of it. But that was a lie, because somewhere along the way, I started falling for him. And falling for Jake wasn't like falling for anyone else. It felt like finally coming home after years of wandering lost. But the thing about Jake, he wasn't built for forever. He was the kind of person who lived in moments, who took what life gave him without thinking too far ahead. And I, fool that I am, wanted more. I wanted him. All of him. It all came crashing down one night when he told me he'd started seeing someone. He said it casually, like it was no big deal, like he wasn't tearing my heart out and handing it back to me. "She's cool," he said, smiling like nothing had changed. "I think you'd like her." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, you bet." He didn't notice the way my hands shook when I reached for my drink. He didn't see the way my smile cracked around the edges. And I knew, in that moment, that he didn't feel the same way about me. Not even close. We tried to stay friends after that. I told myself I could handle it, that I could pretend like everything was fine. But every time I saw him, every time I heard him talk about her, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. And the worst part? He had no idea. The end came quietly. No big fight, no dramatic goodbye. Just a slow, painful drifting apart. One day, I realized I hadn't heard from him in weeks. And when I finally worked up the courage to text him, all I got was a short, polite reply that made it clear he'd moved on. And just like that, he was gone. It's been months and I still think about him. I still catch myself scrolling through our old messages, rereading the stupid jokes and late-night confessions that once felt like everything. I still hear songs that remind me of him, still see things that make me want to text him, even though I know I shouldn't. People say sleeping with your best friend is a gamble, that it either makes everything better or ruins everything you had. For me, it was both. For a little while, I got to have him, really have him, and even though it ended the way I always knew it would, I wouldn't take any of it back. Because the truth is, some people aren't meant to stay in your life forever. Some people are just meant to pass through, to leave you with memories that hurt in the best and worst ways. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some love stories aren't meant to last. Maybe they're just meant to remind you what it feels like to be alive. And even though it hurts, even though I'll probably miss him for a long, long time, I'm still grateful. Because for a little while he was mine. And that's something. It all started with a dead plant. I'd bought it about 2 months ago from the farmer's market. A cute little succulent in a ceramic pot. The lady who sold it assured me it was impossible to kill, which felt like a challenge I was destined to lose. I nodded politely as she explained that succulents only need watering once a month and sunlight, but not too much sunlight. It sounded simple enough, and I walked away feeling weirdly proud of my purchase, as if I'd taken the first step toward becoming the kind of person who keeps houseplants alive and owns multiple throw pillows. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. I watered it exactly twice, gave it a spot on the windowsill, and told myself I was nailing this whole plant parent thing. Then life happened. I got busy with work, forgot to check on it, and by the time I remembered, it had transformed from a perky green miracle into a withered brown tragedy. I stared at it this morning, hoping it might somehow resurrect itself if I squinted hard enough. But no, it was dead. Very dead. And I was left holding the tiny pot, trying to decide if it was worth saving or if I should just give up and throw it in the trash with the half-eaten takeout containers. This, of course, led me down a spiral. If I couldn't keep a succulent alive, literally the easiest plan in the world, what hope did I have for everything else? I stood there, staring at the plant like it was a symbol of all my failures. Unread emails, laundry still sitting in the dryer, gym membership I hadn't used since I signed up for it as a New Year's thing. It wasn't just a dead succulent. It was the proof that I was barely holding life together. I sighed and set the pot back on the windowsill, half hoping some miracle of botany might occur if I left it alone long enough. Then I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to shake the feeling that I was losing a game I didn't even know I was playing. It was around that time I remembered that I was supposed to meet a friend for lunch. I glanced at the clock, 11:45. I was already late. Great. I shot off a quick text. On my way. Be there soon. Which was of course a lie. I wasn't even dressed yet. And the odds of me getting there in under 30 minutes were roughly the same as the dead succulent springing back to life. But I figured if I moved fast enough, I could minimize the damage. I threw on some clothes, cleanish but nothing impressive, and tried to fix my hair in the mirror. It was doing that weird cowlick thing where no amount of water or frustration could convince it to behave. I sighed, grabbed my keys, and ran out the door, hoping the universe would be kind today. Spoiler, it was not. Traffic was a nightmare, of course. Red lights every block, pedestrians crossing at a glacial pace, and some guy in a minivan who kept swerving into my lane as if he didn't believe in turn signals. By the time I made it to the restaurant, I was 20 minutes late and sweating through my shirt. Perfect. I spotted my friend immediately, sitting at an outdoor table, sipping iced tea, looking far more put together than I ever managed to be. She gave me a smile that said, "I know you're late, but I'm being nice about it." Sorry. I gasped as I dropped into the chair across from her. Traffic was insane. She raised an eyebrow. Traffic? We live 5 minutes from each other. Yeah, well, I trailed off, knowing she wasn't buying it. I got stuck behind a minivan. She smirked but let it go, which is one of the reasons we're still friends. Order fast. I already asked them to hold off, so you wouldn't miss the food. I grabbed the menu, scanning it quickly even though I already knew I'd get the same thing I always order. The server appeared just in time, and I rattled off my request, hoping my tardiness would be forgiven once the food arrived. Lunch itself was nice. Good food, decent conversation, the usual. But the whole time, my brain kept circling back to that stupid plan on the windowsill. Why did its death bother me so much? It wasn't like I'd lost a beloved pet or even something expensive. It was a plant, a disposable one at that, and yet it still felt like a tiny, nagging failure I couldn't quite shake. At some point, my friend must have noticed I was zoning out because she gave me a curious look. "You good? You seem off." I shrugged. "Yeah, just my succulent died." She blinked. "That's the emergency?" "No," I said quickly. "It's just, I don't know. It was supposed to be easy. You know? Like this one thing I could do right." She gave me the kind of smile people use when they don't quite understand but want to be supportive. "It's a plant. It happens. Get a new one." I knew she was right, but the thought of replacing it just felt off. Like pretending the first one hadn't been a total disaster. "Yeah," I mumbled, poking at the remains of my sandwich. "Maybe." We wrapped up lunch, split the bill, and promised to hang out again soon, knowing full well that soon would probably mean 2 months from now, after 3 rounds of canceled plans. That's just how things go these days. Everyone's busy, tired, and slightly overwhelmed, doing their best to stay afloat while pretending they aren't. When I got home, the first thing I did was check on the succulent, as if anything miraculous could have happened in the 2 hours I'd been gone. Spoiler, it was still dead. I picked it up, turning the pot in my hands like maybe I'd missed some hidden sign of life. But no, it was a goner. There was nothing to do but admit defeat. For a second, I thought about tossing it, just cutting my losses and moving on. But instead, I set it back on the windowsill, giving it one last shot at redemption. Not because I believed it would come back, but because, well, I didn't really know why. Maybe it was just easier to leave it there than admit I'd failed at something so small. And as I stood there, staring at my sad little dead plant, I realized something. Life is full of dead succulents. Plans that don't pan out. Things you forget to water. Goals you set but never quite achieve. And maybe the trick isn't avoiding failure. It's learning to live with the small ones. I sat down on the couch, feeling a little lighter. The plant was dead, yeah, but the world hadn't ended. I could get a new one or not. Either way, I'd be fine. And maybe that was the lesson all along. Sometimes it's okay to let things go. Even succulents. It started with a joke. One of those dumb, flirty one-liners that only make sense when you're 3 drinks deep. I can't even remember what I said, but it made him laugh. This deep, genuine laugh that caught me off guard. I wasn't trying to pick anyone up that night. I just wanted to unwind, blow off some steam, and avoid thinking too hard about the mess my life had become lately. But sometimes the universe has other plans, and apparently those plans involved him. He wasn't the kind of guy I usually go for. He had this laid-back, almost goofy energy, like he was completely comfortable being exactly who he was. No pretense, no posturing. Just a guy in a wrinkled t-shirt with an easy smile and a voice that made everything he said sound like an inside joke. We were standing by the bar, shoulder to shoulder, talking about nothing in particular, and yet somehow it felt like the most natural conversation I'd had in months. There's something dangerous about that kind of connection. The kind that sneaks up on you and makes you forget that these things almost always end the same way. But I didn't care. Not in that moment. His eyes crinkled every time he smiled, and he kept leaning in closer, like the space between us was just too big to bear. It felt good, better than it should have, and I let myself lean into it. We closed out our tab somewhere around midnight, stumbling out into the cool night air with the kind of giddy energy that only comes from too much alcohol and just the right amount of chemistry. He grabbed my hand as we walked down the street, fingers threading through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Let's keep this going," he said, squeezing my hand. His smile was a little lopsided, a little drunk, and completely irresistible. I knew what he meant, and I knew exactly where this was heading. I could have said no, I probably should have said no, but instead I said, lead the way. His place was a 5-minute walk from the bar, a tiny studio apartment that somehow felt cozy instead of cramped. The kind of place where nothing matched, but everything felt right. He had plants on the windowsill and mismatched mugs on the counter, and something about it made me feel safe in a way I hadn't expected. We didn't waste time. The second we were through the door, we were all over each other, kissing, laughing, peeling off clothes with the kind of urgency that makes you feel like the night might slip away if you don't grab onto it fast enough. The sex was good, not earth-shattering, not life-changing, but good in that comfortable, satisfying way that makes you forget for a little while that the world exists outside this room. We tumbled in a bed together, tangled up in sheets and limbs, lost in each other and the moment. And for those few hours, everything felt simple, easy, like maybe life didn't have to be as complicated as I always made it. But mornings are unforgiving. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, slicing across the room in harsh angles that made everything look sharper than it had the night before. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to hold on to the last traces of the night. His arm was draped over me, heavy and warm, and I could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing against my back. It should have felt comforting. It didn't. Instead, all I felt was that familiar, sinking weight, the one that always shows up after nights like these. The one that whispers, "What are you doing?" I knew how this would go. I'd slip out of bed, throw on last night's clothes, and tiptoe out the door before he woke up. I'd tell myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just one night, that this was fine. But the truth? It wasn't fine. It never really was. I stared at the ceiling a little longer, letting the silence stretch between us like a chasm, before finally dragging myself out of bed. His arm slipped off me with a soft thud, and I winced at the sound, as if it had confirmed something I didn't want to admit. I found my clothes scattered across the floor, pulling them on slowly, deliberately, like the weight of each piece was somehow heavier in the morning light. Last night's confidence felt like a distant memory, replaced by something colder, sharper. I knew I should leave. Just walk out, close the door behind me, and let this be nothing more than a fleeting memory. But for some reason, my feet wouldn't move. He stirred as I was slipping on my shoes, his voice thick with sleep. "You heading out?" I forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "Yeah, I've got a lot to do today." He nodded, propping himself up on one elbow, his hair sticking out in every direction. "It was fun," he said, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "Yeah," I whispered, not trusting myself to say anything more. And just like that, it was over. The walk to the curb felt longer than it should have, the morning air cold against my skin. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, but it didn't help. The chill I felt wasn't the kind you could shake off with layers. It was the kind that settled deep in your bones, making you question everything. The Uber ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. I stared out the window, watching the city pass by, and tried to convince myself that I was okay, that this was fine, that it didn't matter. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't regret the night, not exactly, but I regretted the way it left me feeling empty, like I'd reached for something that wasn't really there, hoping it would fill the cracks, and ended up with nothing but the echo of my own loneliness. I got home, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my bed without bothering to change. The ceiling above me stared back, blank and indifferent, and I lay there for what felt like hours, trying to piece myself back together. It's funny how these nights always play out the same way. You think it'll be different. You think this time it'll mean something, but it never does. And the worst part? I know I'll do it again. I'll go out, have another drink, meet someone new, and let myself believe, just for a little while, that it'll be enough. Because the alternative, facing the emptiness head on, feels too heavy to bear. Maybe one day I'll figure out how to stop. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll keep chasing moments that burn bright and fade fast, hoping that eventually one of them will stick. But for now, I'm just trying to make it through the mornings, one breath at a time. It was the kind of relationship where you think you're safe. Not perfect, but stable, solid in the way you feel when you know someone's favorite sandwich or how they like their coffee, or which of their stupid TV shows will cheer them up after a bad day. I thought we had that kind of connection, something unshakable. But it turns out, comfort makes you blind. You stop looking for cracks until you're falling through them, wondering how the hell you didn't see it coming. It started small, like all betrayals do. A missed call here, a forgotten text there. Things that felt more annoying than alarming at first. He'd always been good about staying in touch. Quick check-ins throughout the day, even when he was busy. But lately, his phone was becoming more like a black box. Locked, muted, always face down. When I asked him about it, he smiled and said, "Relax, babe. You know I hate notifications." And I let it go. Of course I did, because that's what trust looks like, right? You believe them when they tell you not to worry. Even when your gut twists in protest, you tell yourself it's just anxiety talking. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. I shoved the feeling down, buried it beneath excuses. He's just stressed. I'm overreacting. He'd never do that to me. Then he started working late. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed the change. I told myself not to be that person, the one who freaks out over every shift in routine. People get busy. Deadlines pile up. It happens. But the excuses were always vague. Got caught up with some projects. Ran into an old friend after work. He gave me just enough to make it sound reasonable, but never enough to make it feel right. One night, he came home smelling different. Not bad, just different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was a scent I didn't recognize. "You get new cologne?" I asked, half joking. He shrugged. "Sample at the mall." Thought I'd try it. He kissed me on the forehead, like that answer was supposed to smooth everything over. And for a while, it did. But the scent stayed with me, clinging to the edges of my thoughts like the last notes of a song you can't stop hearing. Then came the text from numbers without names, random, short, and just frequent enough to make my stomach churn. I only saw the previews, flashes of words that never made sense. "Had a great time," or "When can we meet again?" When I asked him about them, he brushed it off, said they were spam. But the way he grabbed his phone whenever it buzzed, like it was a grenade about to go off, that didn't feel like spam. The night I finally broke was a Saturday. He told me he was meeting a friend for drinks, and I almost believed him. Almost. But when midnight rolled around and he still wasn't home, I started pacing the apartment, heart pounding in my chest. I texted him once, twice, trying to sound casual. "You okay? What time will you be home?" No answer. By 2 a.m., I wasn't just anxious. I was angry. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting for him to walk through and tell me everything was fine. But when he did come home, he wasn't alone. I heard her voice first, soft, giggling, too close to his. My blood turned cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, heart hammering as the sound of their laughter drifted through the front door. When they finally opened it, they saw me standing there, and the look on his face was enough to shatter every last piece of trust one had left. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The girl, blonde, pretty in a way that made my stomach twist, mumbled an apology and slipped past me without making eye contact. And just like that, it was real. The thing I'd been trying so hard not to believe was happening right in front of me. "Who is she?" I whispered, my voice barely holding together. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "It's not what it looks like." God, I hated that line. Like somehow I was supposed to ignore everything I'd just seen and heard. "Then tell me what it is," I said, crossing my arms to keep my hands from shaking. He sighed, long and slow, like I was exhausting him just by standing there. "She's a friend. I ran into her downtown and gave her a ride." That's it. It was such an obvious lie that I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I just nodded. "Okay," I said, stepping aside. "Then show me your phone." His whole body tensed. "What? Your phone?" I repeated, heart pounding in my ears. "If it's nothing, show me." He looked at me like I'd asked him to hand over a winning lottery ticket. "Jesus, you're being crazy." There was the magic word. Crazy. The one they use to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel like the villain in your own story. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "If it's nothing, you won't mind showing me." For a second, I thought he might. I thought he'd hand it over, Prove me wrong. Make me feel like the paranoid idiot I so badly wanted to believe I was. But instead, he turned on his heel and walked away. I don't have to deal with this, he muttered over his shoulder. And that was it. The door slammed behind him, and I just stood there, staring at the spot where he'd been, realizing it was over. Not just the fight, our relationship, everything. He wasn't coming back from that, and neither was I. I packed my things that night. Didn't leave a note. Didn't send a message. Just took what I needed and left the rest behind. As I walked out the door for the last time, the weight on my chest lifted just a little, enough to remind me what freedom felt like. It's been 8 months now. I haven't heard from him, and I don't plan to. Sometimes late at night, I think about that girl, the one he brought home, and I wonder if she knows yet, if she's figured out the lies, if she's heard the word crazy come out of his mouth and felt her heart sink the same way mine did. But then I remind myself it's not my problem. Not anymore. Because the truth is, people like him don't change. They just move on, find someone else to manipulate, someone else to call crazy. And the best thing you can do is walk away before they convince you that you are. And I did. I walked away. And I'm never looking back. The first time I tried flirting with someone at a wedding, I ended up setting a table on fire. Not on purpose, obviously, but if you've ever been single at a wedding, you know how dangerous open bars and questionable decisions can be. I wasn't even planning to hit on anyone that night. I only went because the groom was an old college buddy, and I figured, hey, free food, free booze, what's the worst that could happen? Spoiler alert, the reception was already in full swing by the time I got there. People were dancing, the DJ was blasting Bruno Mars, and I was doing my best to blend into the background like a human houseplant. But then I saw her. She was sitting at a table near the dance floor, sipping champagne and looking bored out of her mind. She was stunning. The kind of stunning that makes you forget how to breathe for a second. Long brown hair, a black dress that fit her perfectly, and this mischievous look in her eyes, like she was just waiting for someone to come entertain her. I could feel my heart start doing that weird flippy thing it does when you're about to make a terrible decision. Naturally, I did what any idiot in my position would do. I downed the rest of my whiskey for courage and made my way over. Mind if I sit? I asked, flashing my most charming and probably slightly drunk grin. She glanced up, giving me a once-over, then shrugged. Sure, I'm not expecting anyone important. Okay, not exactly a warm welcome, but at least I wasn't immediately dismissed. I pulled out a chair and sat down, trying to think of something clever to say. So, you're not here for the bouquet toss, I'm guessing? She smirked, swirling her champagne. God, no. I hate weddings. I'm only here because the bride's my cousin, and she made me promise to show up. Well, I said, raising an imaginary glass. Cheers to family obligations. She laughed, an actual, genuine laugh, and suddenly, things felt a little less terrifying. All right, Jake. You've got this. Just keep it cool. We started talking. Nothing too deep, just casual banter about the wedding, the food, and whether or not the DJ would survive if he played Despacito one more time. I told her my name was Jake, and she introduced herself as Claire. Things were going well, shockingly well. For once, I wasn't tripping over my words or saying anything weird. And then came the candle. There was this stupid little centerpiece on the table. One of those tiny decorative candles floating in a bowl of water with flower petals. Harmless, right? Wrong. At some point during the conversation, I reached for my drink and somehow managed to knock the candle over. It tipped out of the bowl, rolled across the table, and landed, still lit, on a pile of napkins. For a second, Claire and I just stared at it, both too stunned to react. Then the napkins burst into flames. Oh shit, I yelped, scrambling to grab the flaming pile with my bare hands. In hindsight, this was a terrible idea, but in my defense, I wasn't exactly thinking straight. Claire gasped. What are you doing? I'm saving the wedding. I shouted, which sounded way cooler in my head than it did out loud. I managed to fling the burning napkins onto a nearby plate, where they smoldered pitifully before going out. But not before I managed to scorch my hand in the process. Jesus, Claire said, covering her mouth to hide her laughter. Are you okay? Yeah, I muttered, blowing on my hand like an idiot. Just slightly on fire. To my surprise, she didn't run away or call me an idiot. Well, not out loud anyway. Instead, she grabbed a glass of water and dunked my hand in it. "There," she said with a grin. "Crisis averted." I grinned back, feeling equal parts mortified and weirdly triumphant. Well, that wasn't exactly how I imagined this conversation going. "Yeah, me neither," Claire said, still laughing. "But hey, at least it's memorable." We ended up talking for the rest of the night, mostly about how much of a disaster I am, but in a way that felt fun, easy, natural. At some point, the DJ announced the slow dance, and before I could talk myself out of it, I stood up and held out my hand. "Want to dance?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "You think you can manage that without setting the dance floor on fire?" "No promises," I said with a grin. "But I'll try." She rolled her eyes, but took my hand anyway. And just like that, we ended up on the dance floor, swaying awkwardly to some sappy love song. It wasn't perfect. Hell, I stepped on her foot at least twice, but it was nice. As the song ended, she leaned in and whispered, "You know, Jake, for a walking disaster, you're not half bad." "Thanks," I whispered back. "You're not too bad yourself, especially for someone who hates weddings." She laughed, and in that moment, I knew two things. One, I was definitely going to need more whiskey after this. And two, maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as hopeless as I thought. And the best part? Claire gave me her number before the night was over. So yeah, I set a table on fire at a wedding. But somehow, against all odds, I still managed to walk away with a win. Life's weird like... We called it the Great Pepper Spray Incident of junior year. And it's a miracle no one got expelled or blinded. The whole thing started with a bag of hot Cheetos and ended with half the school coughing in the parking lot while the principal threatened to call Homeland Security. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, it all began with Darren. Now, Darren was the kind of guy who didn't believe in subtlety. If Darren wanted to do something stupid, he wasn't going to do it halfway. He was going to take it to the extreme. This was the same guy who once stole the entire scoreboard remote from the basketball gym just so he could flash 420 to 69 during homecoming. Yeah, that Darren. One Friday during lunch, Darren was sitting at our table, stuffing his face with hot Cheetos like a man possessed. At some point, he wiped his eyes without thinking and immediately started screaming. "Oh my God, my eyes!" he shouted, flailing around like he'd been hit with tear gas. Everyone was laughing at first, but after about 30 seconds, it became clear he wasn't faking it. His eyes were bloodshot, tears streaming down his face, and he was gasping like someone had maced him. This should have been the end of the story, just a dumb kid learning the hard way that spicy dust and eyeballs don't mix. But no, Darren decided that if he had to suffer, everyone else was going to suffer too. That's when he pulled out the pepper spray. Now, I have no idea where Darren got pepper spray. I'm pretty sure it's not legal for high school students to carry it, but again, this was Darren. The rules of reality didn't seem to apply to him. He held up the little black canister like it was the One Ring, grinning through his watery, swollen eyes. "Bet this feels worse than hot Cheetos," he said, voice cracking with pure, chaotic energy. The smart thing to do would have been to tackle Darren and take the pepper spray away from him. But we were 16, stupid, and curious. So instead, we egged him on. "You won't do it," Nate said, knowing full well that Darren would absolutely do it. "You don't have the guts." Darren grinned. "Oh, I have the guts." He stood up from the lunch table, held the canister high above his head like a lunatic in an action movie, and, without another word, sprayed a giant, glittering arc of pepper spray into the air. The effect was instant. I don't know if you've ever experienced pepper spray, but it doesn't mess around. Within seconds, it felt like someone had filled the entire cafeteria with burning hot sand. My eyes stung, my throat closed up, and my face felt like it had been set on fire. Everyone else had the same reaction. Kids started coughing, gasping, and rubbing their eyes in panic. Someone screamed, "I'm dying," which didn't help things at all. It was complete pandemonium. Tables got knocked over as people stampeded toward the exits. Someone slipped on spilled milk and went down hard, taking 2 other kids with them. One of the lunch ladies dove behind the counter like she was dodging sniper fire, while another sprinted toward the kitchen, shouting something about chemical warfare. Meanwhile, Darren stood there in the middle of the chaos, blinking through his already ruined eyes, grinning like an idiot. "I told you," he coughed. "Worse than Cheetos." We thought the madness would stay contained to the cafeteria, but nope. The pepper spray cloud spread. Within minutes, the fire alarms went off, and the entire school was evacuated. Kids were pouring out into the parking lot, coughing and gagging like we'd just survived a gas attack. Teachers were shouting instructions, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and the principal was on his walkie-talkie, barking orders like he was defusing a bomb. And Darren? Darren just strolled out of the building with the rest of us, casually sipping his milk carton like nothing had happened. Here's where things took a turn for the truly ridiculous. The fire department showed up, sirens blaring, lights flashing, because someone had told them there was a chemical spill inside the school. That's right. A few sprays of pepper spray somehow escalated into a full-blown hazmat situation. They blocked off the entire building, told everyone to stay outside, and started hauling equipment out of their trucks like they were dealing with radioactive waste. We all stood there in the parking lot, blinking through our burning eyes, trying not to laugh. Darren, of course, was the star of the show. "You guys think they'll cancel school?" he asked, grinning like the Cheshire Cat. And then, as if summoned by his stupidity, Principal Harris appeared out of the crowd, marching toward us with murder in his eyes. "Who did this?" he shouted, each word sharper than the last. Everyone went silent. Nobody dared speak. Even Darren knew that ratting himself out wasn't an option. But before the principal could press us further, one of the lunch ladies, bless her heart, came running out of the building, waving her arms frantically. "It was the Cheetos!" she cried, completely misunderstanding the situation. The spicy dust set off the alarms. I still don't know how she came to that conclusion, but God bless that woman. The principal blinked, clearly tried to process this new information, and then somehow bought it. The official story, according to the school, was that the fire alarms were triggered by an unfortunate interaction between spicy snacks and sensitive smoke detectors. No one got suspended. No one got expelled. And Darren? Darren got away scot-free. But the best part? They actually banned hot Cheetos after that. For the rest of the year, the cafeteria had signs posted everywhere that said, "No flamin' hot snacks allowed on school property." Darren was a legend after that. People would walk past him in the halls and whisper, "Cheeto killer," like he was some kind of folk hero. And every time someone mentioned the pepper spray incident, he'd just grin and say, "Hey, I warned you, Cheetos are dangerous." And you know what? In Darren's weird, twisted way, he wasn't. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. At least, that's what I told myself. Just something casual. No expectations, no pressure. I thought if I kept things light, it would be easier, less complicated, less likely to hurt. I'd been through enough by then, relationships that ended without warning, people who ghosted like it was an Olympic sport. I didn't have it in me to do all that again. So when I met him, I promised myself I'd keep it simple. It started at a party I didn't even want to go to. One of my friends dragged me along, insisting it would be good for me. I showed up already planning my escape, standing awkwardly near the drinks table, scrolling through my phone, when he walked over and made some stupid joke about the playlist. I think it was something about how every party has the same 3 songs on repeat. It wasn't even that funny, but I laughed anyway. I needed to. We ended up talking for hours, tucked away in a corner while the party buzzed around us. He was easy to be around in a way that felt rare. Charming, but not overbearing. Funny, but not trying too hard. It was one of those conversations that feels like slipping into warm water, comfortable and effortless. By the end of the night, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. The next morning, there was a text waiting for me, still recovering from that DJ's playlist. Coffee later, I stared at my phone for a second, trying to ignore the way my stomach fluttered. I knew this was the moment when I should start guarding my heart, but instead I said yes. Our first date was simple, just coffee and a walk through the park. But something about it felt special, like a secret only we shared. We talked about everything and nothing, our favorite movies, our worst first dates, the weird little things that make life bearable. At one point, he asked me what my dream job was, and I laughed, saying I wasn't sure anymore. "That's okay," he said. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones you don't plan." I remember thinking, maybe he's right. Maybe it was okay to not have everything figured out. After that, things moved quickly. We saw each other every chance we got. Dinners, late-night phone calls, lazy afternoons spent watching TV. He made me feel like the only person in the world, like all the disappointments I'd been carrying didn't matter anymore. It felt easy. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself relax. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, of course, it did. The shift was subtle. So subtle that I almost didn't notice it at first. He stopped texting as much, started canceling plans with vague excuses about work or being too tired. When we were together, he seemed distracted, like his mind was always somewhere else. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that people get busy, that not every day can feel like a fairy tale. But the more space he put between us, the more I started to feel that familiar ache in my chest. The one that tells you you're holding on to something that's already slipping away. I remember the exact moment it hit me. We were supposed to meet for dinner, but an hour before, he sent a text. Rain check? That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just 2 words that felt heavier than they should have. I sat there staring at my phone, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the hurt. I knew what was happening, knew this story all too well. I'd seen it play out before, like clockwork. The slow fade, the gradual pulling away until there's nothing left but silence. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. I didn't respond right away. I needed a minute to breathe, to pull myself together. Finally, I typed out a message that felt more like a plea than a text. Can we talk? He replied hours later. Of course. Tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. The next day, I woke up to a message that felt like a punch to the gut. I've been thinking, and I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for. I care about you, but I don't want to hurt you. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. It was the kind of breakup you see in bad rom-coms. Vague, polite, and infuriatingly gentle. As if kindness could make the loss any easier to bear. I wanted to respond with something sharp, something that would make him feel even a fraction of the hurt I was carrying. But instead, I just wrote, "Okay, take care." And that was the last thing I ever said to him. In the days that followed, I tried to piece myself back together. I told myself I'd seen it coming, that I should have known better than to get attached. But logic doesn't make the hurt go away. I replayed every moment in my head, wondering what I could have done differently, wondering if I'd been too much or not enough. But here's the thing. Sometimes people leave, and it has nothing to do with you. Sometimes they walk away, not because you weren't good enough, but because they didn't know how to stay. That's a hard truth to swallow, but it's the truth all the same. I'd love to say I've moved on, that I'm wiser and stronger for the experience. But the truth is, it still stings. Every now and then, I'll catch myself scrolling through old messages, wondering if he ever thinks about me, if he regrets the way things ended. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. These days, I'm trying to be kinder to myself. I'm learning that it's okay to feel hurt, that it's okay to grieve the things that never quite became what you hoped they'd be. It's a slow process, but I'm getting there. And maybe, one day, I'll meet someone who won't leave when things get real. Someone who won't need space every time life gets messy. Until then, I'm just trying to remind myself that love is still worth the risk. Even when it hurts, even when it doesn't last. Because the alternative, closing yourself off, refusing to feel, feels like a different kind of loss. And I'm not ready to give up. Not yet. So I'll keep going. One day at a time. One step at a time. Because as much as it hurts to fall, it hurts even more to stop hoping. And I'm not ready to let go of that hope just yet. It started with the laundry. Or more accurately, it started with my laundry sitting untouched in the dryer for 3 days. I don't know why it's always the last step that breaks me. Washing? No problem. Transferring it to the dryer? A breeze. But folding it and putting it away? That's where things fall apart. Every single time. This morning, I decided enough was enough. Today, I was going to conquer the laundry, reclaim my life, and become the kind of adult who puts things away immediately. That was the plan anyway. I dragged the pile of clean clothes from the dryer onto my bed, determined to finish the job. I even put on some music, something upbeat, like this could be a montage in a feel-good movie. For the first 5 minutes, I was doing great. I folded a few t-shirts, even paired a couple of socks. But then I hit the first speed bump, the fitted sheet. There is no logical way to fold a fitted sheet. You can tuck the corners into each other, try to smooth it out, but at the end of the day, it always looks like you wrestled an octopus and lost. I stared at the crumpled mess in my hands, wondering if I should just ball it up and throw it into the closet. But then I heard the voice of my inner critic. This is why your life is a mess. If you can't fold a sheet, what hope do you have for anything else? And that's how I ended up in a full existential crisis over bed linens at 10 a.m. I tossed the sheet onto the floor in defeat and decided I deserved a break. A little distraction wouldn't hurt. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd scroll through social media for just a minute. Just to clear my head. 45 minutes later, I was knee-deep in a Reddit thread about whether pigeons have regional accents. Apparently, they do. I blinked, realizing how much time I'd lost, and tossed my phone onto the bed like it was the problem. The laundry was still there, waiting for me, judging me with its wrinkled silence. All right, I muttered. Let's finish this. I grabbed a pair of jeans and folded them with as much determination as one can muster when folding pants. But then I got distracted again, this time by the overwhelming need to reorganize my closet. It wasn't on the agenda, but suddenly it felt urgent. I pulled out old sweaters I hadn't worn in years, started a donation pile, and tried to convince myself I was being productive. An hour later, my room looked worse than when I started. Clothes were everywhere, on the bed, on the floor, draped over the chair in that I'll wear this again soon, but not today way. The fitted sheet still sat in a defeated heap by the door, mocking me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, exhausted, and wondered why simple tasks always seemed to spiral into chaos. The thing about laundry, about any chore, really, is that it's never just about the thing itself. It's about everything else. The laundry isn't just laundry. It's a reminder of how life keeps piling up no matter how hard you try to keep up. Every time you think you've caught a break, there's more waiting for you, like a cruel metaphor with fabric softener. I sighed, knowing I couldn't leave the mess for future me to deal with. Future me already had enough problems. So, I took a deep breath, stood up, and started folding again, slowly, methodically, as if finishing this laundry would somehow make everything else in my life a little easier. By the time I finished, it was early afternoon, and I felt an odd sense of accomplishment. The clothes were folded, the closet was reorganized, and the fitted sheet? Well, it was kind of folded. Close enough. I sat on the bed, staring at the neatly stacked clothes, and realized something. The laundry wasn't the problem. The problem was me, my tendency to overthink, procrastinate, and turn simple things into Herculean tasks. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that's just part of being human. I grabbed my phone again, this time with no guilt, and ordered a pizza because I'd earned it. As I waited for it to arrive, I lay back on the bed, surrounded by the rare peace that comes from finishing something, no matter how small. And in that moment, it didn't matter that the laundry would pile up again next week. What mattered was that for today I'd won. The night I decided to visit the 24-hour laundromat down the street was pure impulse. I had laundry piling up at home, sure, but it wasn't urgent. What was urgent was the weird restlessness gnawing at me. The kind that makes your apartment feel too small, your bed too uncomfortable, and every light bulb just a little too bright. I threw some clothes into a duffel bag, half-clean stuff mostly because it wasn't really about getting laundry done, and headed out into the cool October night. The air smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke, and the sidewalks were empty except for a few stray wrappers scuttling along the pavement. It felt like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I got to the laundromat, it was exactly what I needed it to be: quiet, fluorescent lit, and mostly empty. Just a few machines humming in the background, and the dull clink of change dropping into vending machines. There was a girl in the far corner folding towels with the kind of precision you only learn from working retail, and an older man dozing off with a newspaper spread across his chest. I picked a machine near the back, dumped my clothes in, and fed it a few crumpled bills. The machine whirred to life, and I sat down on one of the plastic chairs that bolted into the floor, feeling the slight vibration beneath my feet. I expected it to be boring. I wanted it to be boring. That was the whole point. I was aiming for nothing, a couple hours of mindless waiting, something to shake off the weight I'd been carrying all day. What I didn't expect was for him to show up. I was halfway through scrolling some meaningless app on my phone when the door jingled open, and there he was. Latte. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked the same mostly, same dark curls, same slouched posture, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The only thing that was different was the tiredness in his eyes, the kind that sits just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice. He scanned the room, spotted me, and froze. For a second, we just stared at each other, both of us caught somewhere between recognition and disbelief. Holy shit, he said finally, a grin spreading across his face. It's really you. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's me. He walked over, dragging a mesh laundry bag behind him, and sat down in the chair beside me like no time had passed at all. What the hell are you doing here? He asked, laughing as if the whole thing was some cosmic joke. Laundry, I said, holding up my duffel bag like it was a reasonable explanation. He snorted. At midnight. I shrugged. Could ask you the same thing. Leo grinned, but it was a little softer this time, like the edges of it had worn down. Touché. We fell into easy conversation after that, the way old friends sometimes do. There wasn't a lot of catching up. No big explanations about where we'd been or what had happened since the last time we'd seen each other. Just small talk, little jokes, the kind of low-stakes conversation that feels like dipping your toes into water you're not quite ready to dive into. Leo threw his laundry into a machine across from mine and sat back down beside me, his knee bumping against mine in a way that felt accidental but wasn't. Still living in the same place? He asked. Yeah, I said. Still in that crappy little apartment on 4th Street. He smiled. Of course you are. Something about the way he said it made my chest ache. Not in a bad way, exactly, but like a memory you didn't realize you were still carrying. When our laundry was in the dryers, we wandered over to the vending machines. I bought a packet of peanut M&Ms, and Leo got a Coke, cracking it open with a hiss that echoed in the quiet room. Remember the road trip? He asked suddenly, out of nowhere. I blinked. Which one? You know, the one where the car broke down in the middle of nowhere, and we had to wait 3 hours for a tow truck. I laughed, the memory rushing back all at once. The two of us sitting on the hood of his car under a sky full of stars, passing a bottle of cheap whiskey back and forth to stay warm. Oh man, I thought we were going to freeze to death. And then the tow guy gave us a ride, Leo added, grinning. Remember how he wouldn't stop talking about conspiracy theories? Something about how pigeons were actually government spies. Jesus, yes, I said, laughing so hard my sides hurt. And we just sat there nodding like, yep, totally, pigeons are definitely robots. For a moment, it felt like we were right back there. Two kids sitting on the edge of adulthood, laughing at things we didn't fully understand, believing we had all the time in the world. The dryers beeped, and we went back to fold our laundry. Leo's clothes were a chaotic mess. Socks tangled inside t-shirts, wrinkled pants balled up like discarded paper. Mine weren't much better. We worked in companionable silence, the occasional joke slipping in between folded shirts. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized how much I'd missed him. Not just Leo, but the version of myself that only existed when he was around. When we were done, Leo slung his laundry bag over his shoulder and gave me a lopsided grin. Want to grab a coffee or something? It was such a simple question, but it carried more weight than either of us was ready to admit. I hesitated for a second, feeling the familiar tug of all the things left unsaid between us. The missed phone calls, the unanswered texts, the slow drift of years spent apart. But then I thought about the road trip, the stars, the ridiculous pigeon conspiracy theory, and I realized that maybe some things are worth trying again. Yeah, I said, smiling. I'd like that. We left the laundromat together, our bags slung over our shoulders, the air crisp and clean in the early hours of the morning. The city was quiet, the streets empty except for us, and for the first time in a long while I felt steady, like maybe, just maybe, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Leo bumped his shoulder against mine as we walked, and I bumped him back just like old times. And under the glow of the street lights, with the promise of coffee and conversation ahead of us, it felt like we were picking up right where we'd left off. And that, I decided, was enough. It was never supposed to happen. That's what I told myself. Over and over, as if repeating it would somehow undo it. But the truth is, I always knew it would. Maybe not exactly how it did, but there was always something between me and Eva. It was small at first, easy to ignore, just a look held a little too long or a joke that felt more intimate than it should have. But it was there, like a spark in the corner of your eye that you convince yourself isn't a fire. We'd been friends since college, met during orientation, bonded over a mutual hatred of group projects, and never looked back. She was the kind of friend who felt like a lifeline, the person I could call when everything else in my life felt like too much. And for years, it worked. We never crossed the line, never even got close. Until one night we did. It was a rainy Thursday, and I just had one of the worst days of my life. Lost a promotion I'd been counting on, got stuck in traffic for 2 hours, and ended the day by locking myself out of my apartment. Eva was the first person I called. She showed up within 20 minutes, soaking wet from the rain, carrying a bottle of wine and a pizza. "You look like you need this," she said, grinning as she handed me the food. "You have no idea." We sat on the floor of my apartment, eating pizza and drinking wine straight from the bottle because neither of us could be bothered to find glasses. We talked about everything, work, life, the general unfairness of the universe. And somewhere between the second slice and the third glass of wine, I felt it. That shift. The air between us changed, just slightly, but enough to make my heart race. She must have felt it too, because she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked quietly. "Think about what?" I knew exactly what she meant, but I needed to hear her say it. "Us." I laughed, trying to play it off. "What about us?" She didn't laugh. She just looked at me, really looked at me, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. "I think we'd be good together," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And that was it. That was all it took. One sentence, and everything between us shifted. I kissed her, and she kissed me back, and before I knew it, we were on my bed, hands everywhere, clothes forgotten on the floor. It felt natural, like we'd been waiting for this moment all along, even if neither of us had admitted it. Afterward, we lay in the dark, tangled up in each other, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like everything might actually be okay. She was there, and I was there, and for that one perfect moment, nothing else mattered. But perfect moments never last. The next morning was awkward in a way I hadn't expected. We tried to act normal, made coffee, talked about the weather, but it felt forced, like we were pretending to be versions of ourselves that no longer existed. When she left, she kissed me on the cheek, and I told myself it didn't mean anything. We didn't talk about what happened. Not at first. We just let it become a part of us. Something unspoken, but always present. And for a while it worked. We kept hanging out, kept sleeping together, kept pretending that everything was fine. But the thing about pretending is that it only works until someone wants more. And that someone was me. It happened slowly, the way falling in love always does. At first, it was just little things, the way she laughed at my dumb jokes, the way she curled up against me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore how badly I wanted her. Not just in my bed, but in my life. All of it. Forever. But Eva wasn't built for forever. She was the kind of person who lived in the moment, who didn't plan ahead because she didn't believe in guarantees. And me? I wanted something real, something permanent. And that was the one thing she couldn't give me. The end came sooner than I expected. One night, after we'd spent the day together, she told me she'd started seeing someone else. "It's not serious," she said, as if that would make it hurt less. I smiled, even though it felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. "That's great." I lied. She looked at me for a moment, like she wanted to say something more, but in the end, she just nodded and changed the subject. And just like that, everything between us shifted again. Only this time it wasn't a spark. It was a fracture. We tried to stay friends after that, but it didn't work. Every conversation felt like a minefield. Every touch like a reminder of what I'd lost. And slowly, painfully, we drifted apart. Not because we wanted to, but because we didn't know how to be anything else. The last time I saw her, we hugged goodbye, and it felt like saying farewell to a part of myself I wasn't ready to let go of. But I knew, deep down, that it was over. Not just the sex, but the friendship too. It's been months now, and I still think about her. I still miss her laugh, her sarcasm, The way she made everything feel just a little bit easier. I missed the version of me that existed when I was with her. The one who believed, even for a little while, that everything might be okay. People say that sleeping with your best friend is either the best decision you'll ever make or the worst mistake of your life. For me, it was both. For a little while, I had everything I ever wanted. And then, just like that, it was gone. Would I do it all over again? Honestly, I don't know. Part of me thinks I should have kept my mouth shut, that we should have stayed on our side of the line where things were safe. But another part of me, maybe the bigger part, knows I wouldn't change a thing. Because even though it ended, even though it hurt more than I ever thought it could, at least I got to love her. And for a little while, she was mine. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Last summer, I took a temporary job helping out at a remote bed-and-breakfast. It was way off the grid, buried deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The owners were an older couple who needed someone to keep things running while they traveled for a month. I figured, why not? I could use the extra cash, and spending a few weeks in the middle of nowhere sounded like a nice break from city life. The place was charming enough, an old, wooden lodge with creaky floors and antique furniture. There were only 4 guest rooms, and since it was the off-season, they didn't expect many visitors. Honestly, I thought it would be easy, just me, the forest, and the occasional guest. The first couple of nights went by without a hitch. The B&B was empty, and I spent most of my time reading, listening to podcasts, and wandering the woods out back. The place was isolated, sure, but it was peaceful. No traffic, no noise, just the sound of birds and wind in the trees. I slept with the windows open, letting the cool night air drift in. And then the first guest arrived. He showed up out of nowhere late one evening, just as the sun was setting. I hadn't heard a car pull up, which was weird, considering the long gravel driveway made plenty of noise. 1 second the porch was empty, and the next, there he was, standing by the front door with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The guy looked normal enough, mid-40s, neatly dressed, with a thin, polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the fact that I wasn't used to seeing anyone out here. "Evening," he said, his voice soft. "I have a reservation." I didn't remember seeing his name in the booking log, but I figured the owners might have forgotten to mention it before they left. It wasn't like I had a lot of guests to keep track of anyway. I forced a smile and checked him in, giving him a key to one of the upstairs rooms. As I handed him the key, his hand brushed mine. His skin was cold. Not just cool, but ice cold, like he'd been standing out in a snowstorm, even though it was the middle of summer. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but he just smiled, that same thin, polite smile. "Thanks," he said. "I'll be staying for a few nights." I watched as he disappeared up the stairs, his footsteps soft on the old wood. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. It was just nerves. People could be a little weird sometimes, right? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing creaks and soft thuds from upstairs. Too many for just one person. It sounded like someone pacing, walking back and forth across the room, dragging their feet every so often. I told myself it was just the old floors settling, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours, long past the point where anyone would still be awake. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor above me. It was loud, like furniture being shoved or dropped. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering in my chest, and listened. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense, expecting to hear footsteps or voices. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet of the house settling around me. The next morning, I went upstairs to check on the guest, hoping he hadn't hurt himself or broken anything. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Finally, I unlocked the door with a spare key and pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was made, untouched, and the duffel bag he'd carried in was gone. There was no sign that anyone had stayed there at all. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. I knew I'd checked him in. I knew I'd given him the key. So where the hell did he go? I went back downstairs and checked the front door, but it was still locked from the inside. I even went outside to see if his car was parked somewhere, but the driveway was empty. It didn't make any sense. I told myself that maybe he'd left early. Maybe I just hadn't heard him go. But that didn't explain the noise I'd heard in the middle of the night, or the way the bed hadn't been touched. The day passed in a blur. I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was just tired and overthinking things. But as night fell, that uneasy feeling settled over me again, like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed, double-checking every latch. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft tap, tap, tap at the window. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The window was on the second floor. There was no way anyone or anything should have been able to reach it. Top, top, top. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone tapping their fingernails against the glass. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Then, just as I was about to get up and check, I heard something worse, a whisper, barely audible, but clear as day. "Let me in." I shot out of bed, heart in my throat, and yanked the curtains open. Nothing. Just the night sky and the tops of the trees swaying in the wind. But the glass was cold, so cold it burned my fingers when I touched it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the window, waiting for something to appear out of the darkness. But nothing did. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left the B&B without looking back. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about finishing the job. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. The owners called me a few days later, confused and annoyed that I'd left without notice. I started to explain, but stopped myself halfway through. What was I supposed to say? That a guest who didn't exist had checked in? That something had tapped on my window, whispering to be let inside? They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. I still think about that guest sometimes, about his cold hands, his strange smile, and the fact that he was able to disappear without a trace. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear it again. Top, 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 and a voice, whispering from just beyond the window. "Let me in." The first time I tried to ask a woman out in a coffee shop, I somehow ended up in a latte foam art contest. Trust me, it wasn't part of the plan. I just wanted a cappuccino, and maybe, if I didn't chicken out, a phone number. Instead, I walked away with a very bruised ego and a story I'll probably tell until the day I die. It all started when I saw her standing at the counter, waiting for her order. She had this relaxed, artsy vibe, messy curls, glasses, an oversized flannel shirt, and that kind of half smile that makes you want to say something, anything, just to see if you can make it a full one. I watched as she grabbed her coffee and sat at a table near the window, her nose buried in a sketchbook. Now, I've been on the internet long enough to know that randomly approaching women in public can go very, very wrong. But there was something about her, something that made me think this might be worth the risk. So I ordered my cappuccino, spent a solid 5 minutes psyching myself up, and finally made my way over to her table. "Hey," I said, clearing my throat awkwardly. "Mind if I sit?" She looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes flicking over me with mild curiosity. "Sure," she said after a brief pause. "Okay, good start." I pulled out the chair and sat down, trying not to knock anything over in the process. "I couldn't help but notice you were drawing," I said, gesturing toward her sketchbook. "Are you an artist?" She gave me a small smile, just enough to keep me going. "Something like that," she said. "I do graphic design mostly." "Cool," I said, nodding way too enthusiastically. "I love art. I mean, I'm not very good at it, but I really appreciate it." She raised an eyebrow, amused. "What kind of art do you like?" Now, here's the thing. I don't know anything about art. The only reason I even knew what surrealism was is because I once Googled weird paintings with melting clocks. But for some reason, I blurted out, "Oh, I really like latte art." She blinked. "Latte art?" "Yeah," I said, leaning into the lie like a man with nothing left to lose. Those little designs people make with the milk foam? I think it's super impressive." At this point, I expected her to either laugh or politely tell me to get lost. But instead, her smile widened. "Really? That's funny. I actually used to be a barista." Now I was trapped. There was no backing out of this conversation without admitting I was a fraud. "No way," I said, trying to sound genuinely interested. "Did you, make those fancy hearts and swans and stuff?" "Oh yeah." she said, clearly enjoying herself. I was pretty good too. And that's when disaster struck. Before I could stop myself, I said the 6 dumbest words in the English language. I bet I could beat you. Her eyes sparkled with amusement. Beat me? At latte art? Yeah, I said, because apparently my mouth had decided to keep talking without consulting my brain. How hard could it be? She laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that made my heart do that weird flip-floppy thing again. All right, she said, closing her sketchbook. Let's do it. And just like that, I found myself in the middle of an impromptu latte art competition with a complete stranger. She flagged down one of the baristas who looked far too excited about this and explained the situation. We need 2 lattes, she said, grinning. We're having a foam off. The barista practically cackled. Oh, this is going to be good. They set us up behind the counter, and the entire coffee shop watched as I made an absolute fool of myself. First of all, milk frothing. Way harder than it looks. I burned my hand on the steam wand within the first 10 seconds, spilled half the milk all over the counter, and accidentally used cold brew instead of espresso because I panicked under pressure. Meanwhile, she was working effortlessly beside me, her hands moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of experience. When we finally poured our lattes, hers looked like a perfect heart. Clean lines, symmetrical, the kind of thing you'd see on a Pinterest board. Mine looked like a crime scene. The foam had somehow separated into 2 blobs that vaguely resembled an amoeba having a midlife crisis. The barista held back a laugh as he inspected our work. Well, he said, holding up her cup, this one is clearly a heart. Beautifully done. Then he held up mine. And this one looks like it needs therapy. The entire coffee shop erupted in laughter, and even I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous it all was. Okay, I said, raising my hands in surrender. You win. You are officially the latte art champion. She grinned, looking way too pleased with herself. Told you, she said. I shook my head, still laughing. In my defense, I've only been a barista for like 30 seconds. Well, she said, handing me her perfect latte. Maybe you'll do better next time. I stared at her, stunned. Wait, next time? She shrugged, that mischievous glint back in her eyes. Sure, you owe me a rematch. I blinked, trying to process the fact that not only had I just made a complete ass of myself, but I'd somehow also secured a second chance with her. Deal, I said, grinning like an idiot. We sat back down with our lattes, hers perfect, mine not, and spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. It turns out she wasn't just into latte art. She also loved sci-fi movies, hated social media, and had a soft spot for terrible puns. By the time we finished our drinks, I realized that this whole disaster of an encounter had actually gone better than anything I could have planned. As we stood up to leave, she scribbled her number on a napkin and handed it to me. Text me, she said with a wink, and practice your foam art, Jake. You're gonna need it. And just like that, I walked out of the coffee shop with a napkin in my pocket, a smile on my face, and the distinct feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as hopeless as I thought. Who knew? All it took was a little milk, a lot of chaos, and one very messy latte. We met through one of those dating apps. You know, the kind where you swipe through endless faces, hoping someone will feel more like fate than just another option. I wasn't even looking for anything serious. After years of disappointments, I'd lowered my expectations to ground level. Meet someone halfway decent, maybe grab drinks, and if things went well, at least I wouldn't have to delete the app out of frustration. But he was different. Or at least he seemed different. His first message wasn't a cheesy pickup line or some lazy, hey. It was thoughtful, personal. He mentioned something from my profile that most people would have skimmed right over. So, tell me about that road trip. Where'd you go? It was simple, but it made me smile. And before I knew it, we were texting back and forth like old friends. He had this way of making me feel interesting, like everything I said mattered. I wasn't used to that. Our first date was at this quirky little cocktail bar that he said reminded him of his favorite place back home. I remember feeling nervous on the way there, wondering if the easy connection we had over text would translate in person. But as soon as he smiled at me from across the bar, all my nerves melted away. He was just comfortable to be around. We talked for hours that night about everything from the books we loved to the weird family traditions we grew up with. He walked me to my car afterward, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and said, "This feels like the start of something good." and in that moment, I believed him. The weeks that followed were a blur of good conversations, late-night texts, and spontaneous dates. He made me laugh more than anyone had in years. We'd stay up talking about life, dreams, and all the little things that make you feel close to someone. It felt easy, but not in the shallow, fleeting way so many things do these days. It felt like building something that mattered. And then, without warning, he started pulling away. At first, it was small things. Texts that used to come in the morning now arrived late in the afternoon. Plans that were once set in stone became tentative. "I've just been swamped with work," he'd say, and I wanted to believe him. I told myself not to read too much into it. But the pattern was familiar, too familiar. And deep down, I knew what was happening. I still tried, though. I asked if everything was okay, gave him space when he seemed distant, tried to be understanding without smothering him. But it felt like trying to hold on to sand. No matter how gently I cupped my hands, it slipped through my fingers. And every time he pulled away, a little part of me whispered, "Here we go again." The night it all came crashing down. We were supposed to meet for dinner. I've been looking forward to it all day, excited to see him after a long week apart. But an hour before we were supposed to meet, he sent a text. Something came up. "Can we rain check?" Just like that. No explanation. No real apology. I stared at my phone, feeling that familiar ache settle in my chest. I knew this game. I'd played it before. But this time, I was tired of pretending it didn't hurt, tired of making excuses for someone who couldn't even show up. So I called him. When he answered, his voice was casual, like nothing was wrong. "Hey, what's up?" I took a deep breath. "Are we okay?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that fills your stomach with dread. And then, finally, he said the words I'd been expecting but still wasn't ready for. "I don't think I can do this anymore." I closed my eyes, trying to keep the tears at bay. "Why?" I whispered. "What changed?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I was ready for something real, but I guess I'm not." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he led me on if he wasn't ready. But instead, I just said, "Okay." Because what else could I say? When someone decides they don't want you, all the words in the world won't change their mind. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth is, there's no logic to people leaving. Sometimes they just do. And you're left with all the pieces, trying to figure out what to do next. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I deleted his number, unfollowed him on social media, and told myself I was fine. But healing isn't linear. Some days I felt okay, like I'd finally let him go. And then, out of nowhere, the sadness would hit me again, as sharp and fresh as the day he left. I hated how much space he still took up in my mind. I hated that I kept wondering if he regretted it, if he ever thought about me, if he missed what we had. I know people say that closure comes from within, but it's hard to find closure when someone walks away without warning. It's like trying to close a book when someone else ripped out the last few pages. You're left guessing how the story ends, and no matter how much time passes, part of you is always stuck in that unfinished chapter. But slowly, I've started to learn that not every story needs an ending. Some people come into your life just to teach you something about love, about yourself, about what you deserve. And as painful as it is, sometimes the lesson is letting go. These days, I'm still figuring it out. I'm learning how to stop blaming myself for things I couldn't control, learning how to trust again, even though it feels impossible sometimes. And most of all, I'm learning that it's okay to want more effort, more honesty, more love. Because at the end of the day, I deserve someone who stays. I don't know when or if that person will come along. But for now, I'm okay with that uncertainty. I'll keep hoping, keep trying, because as much as it hurts to lose someone, it hurts even more to give up on the idea that love is out there. So here I am, still standing, still hoping, one step at a time. I found the old Polaroid camera in the back of my closet, buried under a mess of winter clothes and forgotten junk. I wasn't looking for it. Hell, I'd forgotten I even had it. But there it was, scratched up and a little dusty, like it had been waiting for me to pull it back into the light. I sat on the floor with it in my lap, running my fingers over the worn edges. It used to belong to my grandfather. He gave it to me one summer when I was 12, back when I still thought photography was magic, and anything you captured in a photo could stay frozen forever. He told me, a good picture isn't about what's in it. It's about what it makes you remember. I hadn't thought about that camera or my grandfather in years, but now that it was sitting in front of me, it felt like a door had cracked open to a place I didn't know I'd been missing. Without thinking, I grabbed a pack of film from the bottom of the box, loaded it into the camera with a satisfying click, and stood up. I had no plan, no destination in mind, just a sudden urge to go somewhere. So I grabbed my jacket, slipped the camera over my shoulder, and walked out into the night. The city felt different at night, quieter, but alive in a way that didn't need noise. Streetlights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled like rain, even though the sky was clear. I wandered through old neighborhoods, past storefronts that were closed for the night, and alleyways that whispered stories I'd never hear. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Something worth capturing, maybe, or maybe just something to remind me why I'd kept that camera in the first place. Eventually, I found myself by the old train station, the one that barely anyone used anymore. The platform was empty except for a couple of pigeons hopping along the edge, pecking at invisible crumbs. I snapped a picture, just because, the camera whirred, and the film slid out with a soft mechanical hum. I held the photo between my fingers, watching as the image slowly faded into view. An empty platform, ghostly in the streetlight's glow, a moment suspended in time. It wasn't much, but it felt like enough. I kept walking, took pictures of whatever caught my eye. A flickering neon sign, a stray cat curled up on the hood of a parked car, the glow of headlights reflecting off rain-slick pavement. Each time I snapped the shutter, it felt like I was bottling up little pieces of the night, like I might need them later. Around 2 a.m., I found myself at the park near the river. The same park I used to sneak out to when I was a teenager, meeting friends under the cover of darkness, pretending the world outside didn't matter. I sat on a bench by the water and took another picture. The skyline reflected in the dark, glassy surface of the river. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it didn't need to be. That was the thing about Polaroids. They didn't give you the luxury of perfection. Whatever you captured was exactly what it was, flaws and all. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet seep into my bones. Just as I was about to leave, I heard someone call my name. I turned, and there she was, Jess. We hadn't spoken in years, not since life pulled us in different directions. She'd been my closest friend once, the kind of person who knew all the versions of me that I didn't like to admit existed. Seeing her now, standing there in the soft glow of the streetlights, felt like running into a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. Jess, I said, still half convinced she was a trick of the night. She smiled, soft, a little hesitant. Hey, stranger. We sat on the bench together, our breath curling into the cold night air. What are you doing out here? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I had any right to ask. She shrugged, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. Couldn't sleep. You? Same, I said, though it wasn't quite true. Her eyes drifted to the camera hanging around my neck. You still have that old thing, huh? Yeah, I smiled, brushing my fingers over the scratched lens. Guess I never really gave it up. Jess nodded, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. Like we were still two kids sneaking out to the park, chasing some version of freedom we couldn't name. I snapped a picture of her, without warning. Hey, she laughed, swatting at me. You could have at least told me. I grinned, holding up the Polaroid as it developed. Where's the fun in that? The image faded into view slowly. Her smile a little crooked, her hair messy from the wind, but her eyes warm in a way that made my chest ache. She leaned closer to look at the photo, her shoulder brushing against mine. Not bad, she admitted, a playful glint in her eye. I think you captured my good side. I handed her the photo, and she tucked it into the pocket of her jacket without a word. We stayed out there for a long time, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her job, the one she didn't love, but couldn't quite leave. I told her about the mess my life had become, and she listened without judgment, the way she always had. It felt good, like peeling off a bandage you'd forgotten was there, letting the air hit the wound for the first time in ages. At some point, she rested her head on my shoulder, and I let her. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't complicated. It was just us. Two people sitting in the quiet of the night, finding a way back to something that had never really disappeared. When the skies started to lighten, Jess stood up and stretched, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "I should go," she said softly, like she didn't really want to. "Yeah," I murmured, though part of me wanted to ask her to stay. She smiled at me, one of those rare, genuine smiles that felt like a gift. "Thanks for tonight," she said. "I didn't realize how much I missed this." "Me too," I admitted, and for once I meant it. She gave me a quick hug, the kind that lingers just a little longer than necessary. And then she was gone, disappearing down the path with her hands stuffed into her pockets. I stayed on the bench for a while, watching the sun creep over the horizon, washing the world in soft, golden light. Before I left, I took one last picture. The empty bench, the river, the city waking up behind it. It wasn't a great shot, but it didn't need to be. Some things aren't about getting it perfect. Some things are just about remembering. I slipped the Polaroid into my jacket pocket and started walking home, the camera bouncing lightly against my chest with each step. And as the first rays of sunlight warmed my face, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd found exactly what I was looking for. And for now, that was enough. The first crack was so small I almost missed it. We were at dinner, and his phone buzzed on the table. Nothing unusual. He got texts all the time. But this time, when I glanced at the screen, he turned it face down before I could see the name. It was so fast, so smooth, that if I hadn't known him so well, I wouldn't have thought twice. But I did know him, and that tiny, instinctual movement, it wasn't the kind of thing you do unless you're hiding something. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself I was overthinking it. He's just being polite. He doesn't want to be distracted at dinner. But the knot in my stomach said otherwise. Then the behavior started to change. It wasn't just the phone, it was everything. He became distant, almost overnight. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt forced, like I was pulling words out of him with a rope. When I asked what was wrong, he gave me the same answer every time. Nothing. I'm just tired. But it wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was the kind of tired that comes from holding on to secrets. He started going out more too, always with the same vague excuse. Just meeting up with some friends. The first few times I believed him, but then the late nights stretched into mornings, and he stopped inviting me to come along. "It's just a guy thing," he'd say. "You wouldn't have fun." Funny how the things that used to be our things suddenly weren't. One night, he came home at 3 a.m., drunk and stumbling. I sat up in bed, watching as he kicked off his shoes and collapsed onto the couch. "You okay?" I asked quietly. He mumbled something incoherent, waving me off like I was a minor inconvenience. The room smelled like whiskey, and underneath that a trace of perfume, not mine. I knew then. Deep down, I knew. But knowing and accepting are two different things. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe he'd hug someone goodbye. Maybe the perfume had rubbed off. Maybe I was making it all up in my head because I was tired and frustrated. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. Except I wasn't. Not really. A few days later, I noticed another shift. He stopped wearing his wedding ring. It wasn't blatant. He didn't leave it in plain sight. But I saw it sitting on the dresser one morning and realized it hadn't been on his finger in weeks. When I asked about it, he shrugged. "It's uncomfortable," he said. "I don't like wearing it at work." He kissed me on the cheek, all casual and easy, like that would be enough to put out the fire building in my chest. It wasn't. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday night. He was in the shower, and his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Just once. A single text. I tried not to look. I really did. But then it buzzed again. And again. My heart was in my throat as I reached for it. I knew I shouldn't. I knew this was a line I couldn't uncross. But my hand was already moving before I could stop myself. The message preview was right there on the lock screen. "I miss you." I unlocked the phone. The conversation thread was like a punch to the gut. Plans for secret dinners, late-night meetups, inside jokes I didn't understand. And worse? Photos. Pictures of them together, smiling, happy, in places I thought he'd been alone. I scrolled through the messages, my vision blurring with every word. The shower stopped. I heard the curtain slide open, the soft shuffle of him grabbing a towel. I sat there, frozen, the phone still in my hand, my heart beating so loudly I could feel it in my throat. When he walked into the room, water dripping from his hair, he saw me holding his phone. For a second, he just stared at me, and I saw the realization hit him like a freight train. He knew, and I knew. "I can explain," he said, taking a step toward me. I shook my head. "Don't." My voice was steady, but inside I was falling apart. "There's nothing to explain." He sat down on the edge of the bed, hands in his lap, looking more like a guilty child than a grown man. "It didn't mean anything," he whispered. I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that sounds like it's trying to hold back tears. "It meant enough for you to lie about it." For a long time, we just sat there, him with his guilt, me with my heartbreak. There were no apologies, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. I packed my things that night. Not everything, just what I needed. He watched me move around the room, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. And honestly, there was nothing left to say. As I grabbed my keys and walked to the door, he called after me. "Where are you going?" His voice cracked, as if he couldn't quite believe I was actually leaving. I looked back at him one last time, somewhere I don't have to wonder if I'm enough. And with that, I walked out. It's been 9 months now. People ask if I miss him, and I tell them no. And for the most part, that's true. I don't miss him, not the person he turned out to be. What I miss is the version of him I thought I knew, the version of us I thought we were. But that version doesn't exist, and maybe it never did. I still catch myself checking my phone at night, expecting to see a message from him, but it never comes. And that's okay, because every day that passes, I feel a little lighter, a little stronger, a little more like myself again. The other day, I ran into an old friend who asked how I was doing. "I heard about what happened," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "That must have been so hard." I smiled, a real smile this time. It was I said, "But you know what? Some things are worth losing just to get yourself back." And I meant it. It wasn't planned, but these nights never are. I had no intention of going out. I'd been promising myself a quiet evening in, some bad TV, and takeout. But then my roommate barged into my room, already half-dressed, shouting something about how I needed to live a little. 10 minutes later, I was in an Uber with her and 3 of her friends, wearing the first thing I grabbed out of my closet, a dress that I hadn't worn in months because it was just a little too tight and made me feel a little too reckless. The bar was packed, loud, and chaotic in that way that's both exciting and exhausting. Bodies pressed close, neon lights flickering above the dance floor, music thumping through the walls like a second heartbeat. It wasn't long before the tequila shots started making the rounds. The first one went down easy. The second one hit like a warm, fuzzy slap. And by the third, my roommate was dragging me onto the dance floor, laughing as if the night already belonged to us. I wasn't looking for anything or anyone. I was just there to forget about everything. Work stress, my ex, the gnawing sense that my life was drifting in a direction I couldn't quite control. But then there he was. He wasn't the kind of guy you notice right away. There was no flashy entrance, no attempt to steal the room's attention. He was just there, standing by the bar, nursing a drink, looking perfectly content to stay on the edges of the chaos. But when our eyes met, when he caught me watching him and raised his glass in a silent toast, it was like the night shifted on its axis. He wasn't conventionally attractive, not in the chiseled Instagram model way, but there was something about him, something easy like he didn't need to try. He had that quiet confidence, the kind that makes you curious, the kind that makes you want to get closer just to figure out what makes him tick. I didn't wait for an invitation. I slipped away from my friends, weaving through the crowd until I was standing right in front of him. "Hi," I said, bold and a little breathless. He grinned, just a little, just enough to make my heart skip in a way that I knew was trouble. "Hey," and that was it. No awkward small talk, no pretense. We started talking, and suddenly the noise of the bar faded into the background. He asked me where I was from, and I told him. I asked him what he did, and he gave me some vague answer that didn't really explain anything, but somehow I didn't care. Every word felt like an invitation to lean closer. Every glance felt like a dare. One drink turned into two into three, and before I knew it, His hand was on the small of my back, guiding me toward the door with the kind of certainty that left no room for hesitation. The cab ride to his place was a blur of hands and kisses, the kind of urgent, messy moments that make you feel young and reckless and gloriously alive. I knew exactly what I was doing, exactly where this night was headed, and I didn't care. It felt good. He felt good. His apartment was small but neat, clean enough to suggest he had his life together, but messy enough to feel lived in. We barely made it through the door before we were pulling at each other's clothes, tripping over shoes and laughing between kisses. By the time we hit the bed, it was all heat and motion and desperation, like we were two people trying to outrun the rest of the world. And for a while, it was perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you forget everything outside of this moment. No overthinking, no worrying, just two bodies moving in sync, chasing something that felt almost like freedom. But then morning came, and with it, the cold, hard truth that it was all just a beautiful illusion. I woke up to sunlight pouring through the windows, slanting across his bare shoulders. For a second, I stayed still, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, pretending that this was something more than what it was. His arm was draped over me, heavy and warm, and it should have felt comforting. But all I could feel was that familiar ache settling in my chest. I knew I should leave. It's always better to leave before things get awkward, before the morning light strips away the magic and leaves behind nothing but awkward glances and half-hearted promises to do this again sometime. But something kept me there just a little longer. Maybe it was the way he looked so peaceful in sleep. Or maybe it was the way I felt too tired of running, too tired of pretending that nights like this didn't leave scars. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, gathering my clothes from the floor in silence. Every piece felt heavier than it had the night before, weighed down by the knowledge that this wasn't what I wanted. Not really. He stirred as I reached for my shoes, his voice rough with sleep. "You leaving?" I turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Yeah, I've got to get going." He nodded, his expression soft, understanding. "It was nice, though," he said, and for a moment, it almost sounded like he meant it. "Yeah," I whispered. "It was..." And just like that, it was over. The walk to the curb was cold and quiet, the morning air biting at my skin. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, but it didn't do much to keep out the chill. The Uber ride home was filled with the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of everything. Every bump in the road, every shift in the seat, every thought you'd rather not be having. I told myself it was fine, that it didn't matter, that it was just one night, and that's all it was ever supposed to be. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nights like these always leave something behind, something unspoken, something unfinished. It wasn't about him. It never is. It was about me, about the endless search for something that always seemed just out of reach. About the way I kept throwing myself into these fleeting moments, hoping that one of them would finally fill the space inside me that never seemed to stay full. I got home, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my bed, staring at the ceiling like it held all the answers I'd been too afraid to ask. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, and I realized, maybe for the first time, that I was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of running, tired of waking up in strange beds, chasing highs that never lasted. Maybe I'll stop. Maybe I'll figure out how to want less, or how to want something real. Or maybe I'll keep going one night at a time, hoping that eventually one of these mornings will feel different. But until then, all I can do is keep moving forward. One breath, one night, one morning after the next. I wish I could tell you there was some big moment where it all clicked, some dramatic discovery like walking in on him with someone else or catching a text that gave it all away. But the truth is, it wasn't one moment. It was a collection of them. Small, barely noticeable shifts that added up over time until the truth was staring me in the face, daring me to do something about it. The first shift was his absence. Not physical absence. He was still there, but not there. We could sit in the same room for hours, and it was like he wasn't even with me. I'd talk, and he'd nod at all the right moments. But his eyes were somewhere else, his mind miles away. I told myself he was stressed. Work had been hectic lately, and everyone has their moments. But the thing about absence is that it has a way of creeping in, slowly replacing everything else until all that's left is an empty space where love used to be. Then came the phone. You can learn a lot about someone from the way they use their phone. His had become an extension of his hand. Always there, always locked, always hidden. He used to leave it lying around without a second thought, but now it was glued to him. When it buzzed, he'd grab it so fast it was like he was disarming a bomb. If I so much as glanced at the screen, he'd tilt it away from me, smiling like I was imagining things. "Who's texting you?" I asked once, only half joking. "Just a friend," he said, too casual, too smooth. "Relax, babe. You're being paranoid." Paranoid. That word dug under my skin, made me second-guess myself in ways I didn't even realize at the time. I didn't want to be the insecure girlfriend, the one who reads too much into everything. So I swallowed my doubts, told myself I was overreacting. But doubt, once planted, is hard to uproot. Then there were the nights out. He used to invite me to everything, group dinners, game nights, even casual meetups with friends. But lately, his invitations had dried up. "It's just the guys," he'd say, grabbing his keys. "You wouldn't have fun." And every time, I nodded and smiled, telling myself it was no big deal. But the loneliness that crept in when he was gone told a different story. The first real crack appeared one night when he came home smelling like someone else. I don't mean perfume, though yes, there was that too. It was something deeper, a scent of intimacy, the kind that sticks to your skin after being pressed too close to someone you shouldn't have been close to. I asked him about it, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where were you tonight?" He shrugged, kicking off his shoes without looking at me. "Out with some friends." "Who?" He paused for a beat, just long enough to tell me he was coming up with a lie. "You don't know them," he said, already walking to the bedroom. "Stop making this a thing." I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, realizing that I already knew. I just didn't have the proof yet. The proof came 2 weeks later. He had fallen asleep on the couch, phone still clutched loosely in his hand. For a moment, I stood over him, debating with myself. I knew what I was about to do would change everything, but the knot in my stomach was too tight to ignore. So I took a deep breath, grabbed his phone, and unlocked it with a passcode I'd seen him type 1,000 times. And there it was. Her name was Claire. The messages were all there. Late-night confessions, secret plans, little hearts and winks scattered through their conversations. Photos of the two of them, wrapped up in each other, smiling in ways he hadn't smiled at me in months. I sat down on the edge of the couch, holding his phone like it might burn a hole through my skin. I stared at those messages until the words blurred together, my chest tightening with every scroll. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the ease of it. The way he'd lied to me, night after night, without a second thought. He stirred in his sleep, and for a moment, I thought about throwing the phone at him, waking him up with a confrontation he wouldn't forget. But what was the point? I already had my answer. The next morning, I waited until he left for work. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the quiet apartment that had once felt like home. And then I packed my things. Not all of them, just the essentials. Enough to walk out the door without looking back. I left the phone on the counter, unlocked, with the messages still open. He'd find them soon enough. I didn't leave a note. What was there to say? I know. Good luck with Claire? None of it would change anything. He called me that night. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't answer. His text came next. "Can we talk?" "It's not what it looks like." "Please, let me explain." I blocked him before I could get sucked back into the lies. It's been 6 months now. Some days, the hurt feels distant, like an old bruise that only aches when you press on it too hard. Other days, it feels fresh, like I just found those messages all over again. But every day, it gets a little easier, a little lighter. People ask me if I regret leaving without a fight. I don't. There are some battles that aren't worth fighting, especially when the person you're fighting for has already given up on you. The other day, I ran into him at a coffee shop. He was with her Claire. They looked happy, standing there in line, laughing over something I didn't care to understand. For a moment, I wondered if he ever thinks about me, if he ever feels even a flicker of guilt for what he did. But then I realized it doesn't matter. His chapter in my life is over, and I'm finally writing a new one. And this time, This time, it's all about me. I didn't set out to clean the fridge. It just sort of happened. I went to grab a snack. Something quick like string cheese or leftover pasta, but when I opened the door, the smell hit me like a brick wall. Not as someone forgot the lid on the pickle jar smell, but as something in here and it's too late to save it situation. You know the kind, the one that makes your whole body recoil like you've just uncovered evidence of a crime. I stood there, frozen in the cold glow of the refrigerator light, debating my next move. I could close the door and pretend I didn't smell anything. Maybe it would go away if I ignored it long enough. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't going to happen. The fridge was a ticking time bomb, and sooner or later, I'd have to deal with it. So, I grabbed the trash bag, rolled up my sleeves, and plunged in. The first thing I found was a half-full container of hummus that had become a science experiment. Mold bloomed across the surface like some alien terrain, and I had to fight the urge to gag as I tossed it into the trash. Next came a carton of eggs, expired 3 weeks ago. I shook it gently, wondering if eggs go bad quietly or if they eventually explode like little sulfur grenades. I decided not to find out and dumped the whole carton without a second thought. After that, things only got worse. I discovered a jar of salsa that had turned a deep, concerning shade of brown. A plastic bag of something unidentifiable, I'm guessing lettuce in a former life, was now just a slimy puddle. The worst offender, though, was the takeout container lurking in the back corner. I opened it because apparently I enjoy suffering and was immediately punished with a smell that defied description. Whatever it was, it had definitely evolved beyond food. By the time I cleared the top shelf, my hands smelled like old dairy, and I was seriously questioning my life choices. Why did I let it get this bad? How did other adults keep their fridges so clean? Did they just throw things out the second they felt suspicious? Or were they out there buying only enough groceries for one day, like those people who casually mention, "Oh, I shop daily just for the essentials," as if that's a normal thing? I paused to wipe down a sticky patch on the middle shelf that looked like it might have been barbecue sauce at some point. As I scrubbed, my mind wandered to all the other things in my life I'd let pile up. Emails I hadn't answered, bills I'd been meaning to pay, social plans I kept dodging because life is just a lot right now. It was weird how much this stupid fridge felt like a metaphor for everything. It starts with one small thing, forgetting to toss out the leftovers, and before you know it, you're knee-deep in expired yogurt and existential dread. Eventually, I reached the fridge door, where condiment bottles lived far past their expiration dates, as if they'd been granted asylum. I checked the labels and realized I'd been holding on to ketchup that expired last year. Why? Was I waiting for the right moment to use ancient mustard? Why do I even have 3 kinds of mustard? I stared at the bottles for a long time, trying to decide what to keep and what to toss. It felt ridiculous to be this stressed about condiments, but here we were. I ended up throwing out 2 of the mustards, purely out of spite. After about an hour of work, and several breaks where I sat on the kitchen floor contemplating my life, the fridge was finally clean. And by clean, I mean it no longer felt like an active health hazard. Everything left was either edible or questionable, but not in a way that could get me sued. I wiped down the shelves, closed the door, and leaned against the counter, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. I thought about celebrating, but I had no energy left. Cleaning the fridge had drained me in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the physical effort. It was the emotional toll of facing all the little things I'd ignored for way too long. The fridge had been a quiet reminder that sometimes life is just about maintenance. You can't avoid the mess forever. At some point, you have to roll up your sleeves and deal with it. I poured myself a glass of water, opened the now empty fridge door, and stared into its clean, orderly shelves. It was beautiful, cold, white, and pristine like the promise of a fresh start. I knew it wouldn't last, of course. In a week or 2, something else would go bad. More leftovers would get forgotten, and some new condiment would make its way to the back corner, only to be discovered months later. But for now, it was perfect. I stood there, sipping my water, and allowed myself to feel weirdly proud. Sure, it wasn't a major life accomplishment. No one was going to give me a medal for not living in filth. But it was a win, and these days I'll take whatever wins I can get. I put the glass back in the fridge, Not because I needed to, but because it felt good to open the door and see everything exactly where it belonged. And for a moment, standing there in my quiet kitchen, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I had my life together. At least until the next time something went bad. But that was a problem for future. The first time I tried flirting in a grocery store, I accidentally kidnapped a watermelon. Yeah, you read that right. I went in for pasta and somehow walked out with a fruit I didn't even want. It all started on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I was wandering the aisles, half-heartedly debating whether to cook or just order takeout again, when I saw her. She was standing by the produce section, holding a pineapple in one hand and examining it like she was a world-class fruit critic. I don't know what came over me, but something about the way she looked completely focused on that pineapple as if it held the secrets to the universe made me want to talk to her. I mean, people meet at grocery stores all the time, right? If rom-coms have taught me anything, it's that spontaneous, charming conversations over fruit are totally normal. Just be smooth, Jake, I told myself. Say something witty. It's not that hard. So, naturally, I walked up to her, pointed at the pineapple, and said, "Careful with that, it's known to bite." She looked up, eyebrows raised, clearly confused but not entirely put off. "Excuse me?" "The pineapple," I said, trying to recover. "Sharp on the outside, sweet on the inside. Dangerous combo." She blinked, probably wondering if I was having a stroke. But then miraculously, she smiled. "I guess I'll take my chances." "All right, not a total disaster. I could work with this." "You seem like a fruit expert," I said, nodding toward her pineapple. "Mind helping me out? I can never tell if watermelons are ripe or not." She tilted her head, clearly amused. "You just tap them," she said, demonstrating with a gentle knock on the side of a nearby watermelon. "If it sounds hollow, it's good." "Oh," I said, pretending like I hadn't just learned that. "I always thought you had to shake them. You know, like coconuts." She laughed. Actually laughed. And suddenly I felt like the smoothest man alive. "Okay, Jake. You're in. Now just keep it together." Then she handed me the watermelon. "Here," she said with a grin. "Give it a try." What I should have done was knock on it like she did. But instead, my dumbass brain kicked into overdrive. And for some reason, I decided to cradle the watermelon in my arms like it was a newborn baby. "Yeah," I said, rocking it gently. "This one feels emotionally available." She burst out laughing, and I thought, yes, nailed it. Except I was so caught up in the moment that I didn't realize I was still holding the watermelon when she turned to leave. "Thanks for the tip," I called after her, giving her a little wave with my free hand. She waved back, still smiling, and walked away. And that's when it hit me. I was standing in the middle of the produce section, cradling a watermelon I had absolutely no intention of buying. Now, a smarter man would have put it back. But not me. Nope. I panicked. In my mind, the only logical thing to do was commit, so I shuffled toward the checkout line, still holding the watermelon like it was my firstborn. The cashier gave me a weird look as she scanned it. "That's a nice watermelon," she said, clearly not sure how to handle the situation. "Thanks," I said, dead serious. "We're very close." She nodded slowly, as if she were dealing with someone in the middle of a mental breakdown. "Right? That'll be $7.99. I paid for the damn thing, still too flustered to think straight, and shuffled out of the store with my watermelon tucked under one arm. As I reached the parking lot, I spotted her again, Pineapple Girl, loading her groceries into the trunk of a little red car. She saw me, grinned, and called out, "Nice choice." Without thinking, I held up the watermelon like I was Simba presenting baby Simba to the animal kingdom. "Thanks. I think we'll be very happy together." She laughed again, a full, genuine laugh that made me forget how ridiculous I looked. "Well, good luck with that," she said, giving me one last smile before getting into her car. I stood there for a second, holding my watermelon and grinning like an idiot. I didn't get her name or her number. I didn't walk away with a date. But somehow, I felt like I'd won. And you know what? That watermelon was delicious. We had this thing at our school called Field Day. You know, one of those days when the teachers give up, roll out some obstacle courses and tug-of-war ropes, and pretend it's educational so they don't have to do actual work. Most of us hated Field Day. It was hot, boring, and half the time, someone would sprain an ankle during dodgeball, which meant we'd have to sit through some painfully long safety lecture about responsible participation. But that particular field day was different, because that was the year our friend Josh decided to turn field day into something no one would ever forget. Josh was one of those guys who lived for chaos. He was always coming up with dumb ideas, jumping off roofs into swimming pools, lighting weird things on fire for science, and once convincing the entire school that the history teacher used to be in a biker gang. He never got caught for any of it, which gave him the kind of invincibility complex that only teenage boys and cartoon villains possess. On the morning of field day, Josh showed up with a backpack full of fireworks. I remember standing there with my friends, watching him unzip the bag with this huge grin on his face. Inside were Roman candles, bottle rockets, firecrackers, the works. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered. Josh grinned like a lunatic. "I'm calling it Operation Chaos," he said. "I'm going to launch these bad boys during the tug-of-war match." Naturally, we all try to talk him out of it. "Dude, you'll get expelled," Nate said, looking genuinely concerned for once in his life. But Josh just shrugged. "I mean, what are they going to do? Not let me graduate?" To this day, I don't know what possessed us to go along with it. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the fact that field day sucked. Or maybe it was just peer pressure working its magic. Whatever the reason, we all agreed to help Josh pull off Operation Chaos. The plan was simple. During the final event of the day, an epic all-grade tug-of-war between the seniors and the juniors, Josh would sneak behind the bleachers, light a couple of Roman candles, and fire them across the field. "It'll look like the Battle of Hogwarts," he said proudly. None of us knew exactly what a Roman candle did, but we were pretty sure it was going to be hilarious. So there we were, standing on the field under the scorching sun, pretending to care about field day. The seniors and juniors were lined up on opposite ends of the giant rope, trash-talking each other like this was the Olympics. Teachers were milling around, trying to keep order, but clearly wishing they were anywhere else. And in the middle of it all, Josh slipped away with his backpack of doom. It was go time. We watched from the sidelines as Josh crouched behind the bleachers, fiddling with a lighter. The rope tension was building. Kids were wrapping it around their hands, digging in their heels, ready to pull with all the strength their teenage bodies could muster. The gym teacher blew his whistle, and the tug-of-war began. And that's when Josh lit the first Roman candle. Poof! A ball of bright red fire shot into the sky, followed by a crackling trail of sparks. It arced beautifully across the field, drawing gasps from everyone watching. For a brief moment, it looked like the coolest thing ever, like we were about to turn field day into the finale of a summer blockbuster. But then Josh fired the second Roman candle. Bang! This one didn't go up. It went sideways, straight into the rope. The whole thing happened in slow motion. The rope, already taut from the two teams pulling with everything they had, exploded into flames. Kids screamed and let go, but the rope was frayed and still hot, which meant that a bunch of them got tangled up in it. The juniors and seniors collapsed in a heap, rolling around in the grass, slapping at their burning shoes and yelling things like, "Stop, drop, and roll." Josh, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, panicked. Instead of running away like a sane person, he decided to keep firing Roman candles, because in his mind, the only way out of chaos was more chaos. Poof! 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 More fireballs shot across the field, narrowly missing the teachers who were sprinting toward the bleachers to stop him. One fireball hit the water cooler, which exploded like a mini geyser, spraying everyone in the vicinity. Another fireball hit the giant inflatable arch that said Field Day 2024, and the whole thing started deflating in slow, sad agony. At this point, the principal, who'd been sipping lemonade and pretending not to care about anything, grabbed a megaphone and started shouting, "Who is responsible for this?" That's when the school resource officer showed up. This guy was ex-military and always acted like he was one bad day away from turning the entire school into a boot camp. He stormed onto the field, sunglasses glinting in the sun, ready to take down whoever was behind the chaos. Josh finally decided it was time to bail. He threw the empty Roman candle tube into the bushes, grabbed his backpack, and sprinted across the field like he was being chased by the FBI. And honestly, it looked like he was. The rest of us stood there, frozen in shock, watching as Josh ran toward the parking lot, followed closely by the gym teacher, 2 assistant principals, and the school resource officer. It was like some kind of surreal slow-motion chase scene. We thought for sure that Josh was done for. Expelled, arrested, maybe even deported if the school could swing it. But somehow, he made it to the parking lot, dove into his mom's minivan, and sped off before anyone could catch him. The aftermath was legendary. Field day was canceled indefinitely, and the administration held a series of emergency meetings about student behavior and the inappropriate use of pyrotechnics. They also banned all Roman candles from school property, which felt weirdly specific. As for Josh, he didn't show up to school for a week. When he finally came back, we were convinced he'd been suspended or arrested. But no, he just walked in like nothing had happened, grinning from ear to ear. "What did I miss?" he asked casually, as if the entire school wasn't still talking about his fiery field day stunt. To this day, no one knows how he got away with it. The official story is that the fireballs were spontaneous malfunctions in the equipment, and the teachers were too embarrassed to admit that a student had outsmarted them. And Josh, he never stopped bragging about the time he turned field day into a war zone. Every time someone mentions it, he just smiles and says, "I told you Roman candles make everything better." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. It started with a lie. "I'm only going out for one drink," I told myself, slipping into a black dress that hugged me in all the right places. I didn't believe it even as I said it. Nights like these don't end with one drink. They end with blurry memories, regrettable decisions, and the strange comfort of knowing that, for a few hours, you gotta be someone else. The bar was crowded, loud, and buzzing with energy. People laughing too hard, music turned up just a little too high, and conversations spilling over each other like waves. I made my way to the bar, squeezing between strangers to order something strong enough to drown out the week I'd had. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the bar, drink in hand, wearing a faded hoodie and the kind of smirk that said, "I know exactly how this is going to end." I'd seen guys like him before. Casual, confident, charming in a way that felt effortless. I knew better, but knowing better has never stopped me before. Our eyes met, and that was all the invitation either of us needed. He slid closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of whiskey on his breath. "What are we drinking to?" he asked, his voice low and easy, like we were already in on some secret together. I smiled, raising my glass. "To bad decisions." He laughed, the sound warm and familiar, and just like that, we were off. The conversation flowed easily, the way it always does when two strangers decide to pretend, just for a night, that they've known each other forever. He told me about his job, his hobbies, some ridiculous story about getting locked in a public restroom in Paris. I told him, well, I'm not entirely sure what I told him. A version of the truth. Maybe enough to keep the conversation going, but not enough to leave any real marks. It didn't take long before we were pressed against each other, his hand brushing the small of my back, our drinks forgotten on the bar. And when he leaned in, his lips grazing my ear as he asked, "Should we get out of here?" I didn't hesitate. We stumbled out into the night, arms wrapped around each other as if the cold might swallow us whole if we let go. His apartment wasn't far, and the second we stepped inside, the world outside ceased to exist. Clothes hit the floor. Kisses became urgent, messy. His hands knew exactly where to go, and for a little while, everything felt easy. Simple, like maybe, for just one night, I didn't have to worry about anything but the way his skin felt against mine. The sex was good, great even, the kind of night that makes you feel invincible while it's happening. We laughed between kisses, tangled up in each other like we were trying to outrun something neither of us could name. And for a few hours, I believed the lie I told myself. That this was enough, that this was what I wanted. But mornings have a way of ripping the truth out of you. I woke up to sunlight cutting through the room like a slap. His arm was still draped over me, heavy and warm, and I could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing. For a second, I stayed there, hoping I could hold onto the peace of the night before. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I knew how this would go. I'd done it enough times to know the script by heart. I'd slip out of bed, gather my clothes, and leave before he woke up. I tell myself it didn't matter, that it was just a night, and that I was okay with that. But it never really feels that simple, does it? I slid out from under his arm, careful not to wake him, and began the familiar ritual of dressing in silence. There's something humiliating about pulling on last night's clothes in the light of day, like you're wearing a costume that doesn't fit anymore. He stirred just as I reached the door, his voice rough with sleep. "You sneaking out?" I turned, offering a weak smile. "Yeah, I've got stuff." He propped himself up on one elbow, his hair sticking out in every direction. "Right? Well, it was fun." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "Yeah, it was." And just like that, it was over. The walk to the curb felt longer than it should have, the cold air biting at my skin. I ordered an Uber, wrapping my coat tighter around me, as if that would keep out the chill. But it wasn't the kind of cold you could shake off. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that forces you to sit with every thought you've been trying to avoid. I told myself, it's fine, this is what you wanted. But the truth was sitting heavy in my chest, and no amount of pretending could make it go away. I got home, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my bed without bothering to change. The ceiling above me stared back, blank and unmoving, and I lay there, feeling the weight of the night press down on me. It wasn't him I missed. It never is. It was the lie. The one that says moments like these will fill the empty spaces, that they'll mean something more than they ever do. I wish I could say that was the last time, that I learned my lesson, stopped chasing moments that always left me feeling hollow. But I know myself better than that. I'll go out again. I'll meet someone new, feel that same spark, and let myself believe, just for a little while, that this time will be different. But it won't be. It never is. And the worst part? I'll keep doing it anyway, because the alternative, sitting alone with the silence, with myself, feels even heavier. Maybe someday I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll stop running. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll keep living in these fleeting moments, always hoping the next one will finally be the one that lasts. But until then, all I can do is keep moving, one night at a time, one morning after the next. It started with a fight, not one of those serious, life-changing fights, just one of those stupid arguments between friends that spirals out of nowhere. Ryan and I were at each other's throats over something dumb, probably about who was going to pick up the tab at the bar. By the end of it, we were both pissed off, and I stormed out of his house, not really planning to go home, but needing to cool off. I ended up sitting on the front steps, trying to figure out what I was even mad about. That's when his mom, Lauren, opened the door and stepped outside. She sat down beside me, without a word, just handed me a cold beer like she'd known I needed it. Lauren was hard to describe. She was beautiful, sure, mid-40s, blonde with sharp blue eyes, always dressed like she was effortlessly put together. But it was more than that. She had this calmness about her, like she'd seen everything and nothing could faze her anymore. "You two will get over it," she said after a long moment, taking a sip from her own drink. "You always do." I laughed, more out of frustration than humor. "Yeah, I guess." We sat there in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between two people who don't feel the need to fill the gaps with pointless chatter. The night was warm, and the beer hit just right. "I think you and Ryan are good for each other," Lauren said after a moment. "But you gotta stop being so hard on yourself, too. You carry too much weight." The way she said it, like she could see right through me, made something in my chest loosen. I didn't even realize how badly I needed to hear that until she said it. I looked over at her, and she gave me this soft, understanding smile that did something strange to my heart. I should have said thank you. I should have stood up, finished my beer, and gone home. But I didn't. Instead, I just looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, I noticed the way her eyes softened when she smiled. The way her lips curved, the faint laugh lines around her mouth. She wasn't just Lauren, Ryan's mom. She was someone. She must have noticed the shift, too, because her smile faltered slightly, just for a second. The air between us changed, became something heavier, charged. I should have stood up. I should have walked away. But I didn't. "I always liked you, you know," Lauren said, her voice quieter now. "Ryan's lucky to have you around." Her words hit deeper than they should have, and before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in. It wasn't planned. It wasn't thought through. It was just a moment of weakness. And she kissed me back. It was slow at first, hesitant, like we both knew we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But then something shifted, and the kiss deepened. I don't know who moved first. Maybe her, maybe me. But before I knew it, my hands were on her waist, pulling her closer. We stumbled back inside the house, our footsteps quiet but urgent, the guilt already simmering beneath the surface. We didn't make it to her room. It happened right there on the couch, under the dim glow of the porch light filtering through the windows. When it was over, we lay there, tangled in each other, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on us. "This," she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. "This can't happen again." "I know," I whispered back, even though a part of me didn't want it to end. I should have left right then and there, but I stayed, and that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, we found excuses to see each other. Quick visits when Ryan wasn't around, late-night texts that turned into sneaky rendezvous. It was reckless and selfish, but it was also addicting. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I couldn't walk away. The guilt, though, it ate at me. Every time I saw Ryan, it gnawed at me a little more until I could barely look him in the eye. He had no idea what was going on, no clue that the two people he trusted most were betraying him behind his back. And then, inevitably, it all came crashing down. One night, Ryan found us. It was stupid. We were careless. We thought he was out for the night, but he came home early and walked in on us in the living room. The look on his face when he saw us, God, I'll never forget it. There was this moment where none of us moved, like time had frozen. And then Ryan's expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief to pure, burning rage. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Ryan," Lauren started, but he cut her off. "How long?" he demanded, his fists clenched. "How fucking long has this been going on?" I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That it didn't mean anything? That I was sorry? None of it would matter. "You were supposed to be my best friend," Ryan said, his voice cracking. "How could you do this to me?" There was nothing I could say to fix it. No apology that would make it right. Ryan stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I sat there in silence, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that I'd just destroyed the one friendship that had ever really mattered to me. Lauren tried to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "I think I should go," I muttered, my voice hollow. She didn't stop me. That was the last time I saw either of them. Ryan blocked me on everything, phone, social media, the works. I heard through mutual friends that he moved out of town not long after. And honestly, I don't blame him. As for Lauren, she texted me once, months later. Just a simple, "I hope you're okay." I never responded. What was the point? It's been years now, and the memory still haunts me. Not just the betrayal, but the look on Ryan's face. That moment when he realized the two people he trusted most had betrayed him. Some mistakes fade with time. Others stay with you, buried deep in your chest, reminding you every day of what you lost. And this one? It's the kind that never stops hurting. I ran into my dad's old watch last night. I wasn't looking for it, just digging through some junk drawers, trying to find a spare light bulb, and there it was buried beneath old receipts and dead batteries. It wasn't anything special, just a cheap Timex with a scratched-up face and a cracked leather strap. But seeing it there, after all this time, hit me like a punch to the chest. The watch had stopped at 3:17. I turned it over in my hands, the weight of it heavier than it had any right to be. I couldn't remember the last time I saw him wear it, probably years ago. I'd almost forgotten it existed. And yet, holding it now, it felt like a piece of him was sitting in my palm, as if time had frozen with it. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, just staring at the watch, turning it over and over in my hands like it might reveal some hidden message if I held it long enough. And then, because I didn't know what else to do, I slipped it on my wrist. The leather was stiff, the strap too loose, but it felt right in a strange way. Like something I'd been carrying with me all along had finally found its place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept twisting the watch around my wrist, watching the light catch on the scratched glass face. I didn't know why it unsettled me so much. Maybe it was the reminder that time doesn't wait for anyone, or maybe it was just the fact that I hadn't thought about my dad in a long time. Not really anyway, not in the way that mattered. I decided to go for a drive. That's what he used to do whenever the world got too loud. Get in the car and just drive, no destination, no plan. I used to think it was pointless, the way he'd burn through half a tank of gas just to clear his head. But now, sitting in my too quiet apartment with his watch strapped to my wrist, it made more sense than I wanted to admit. So I grabbed my keys and hit the road. The highway was nearly empty at that hour, just me and a few long-haul trucks rumbling past. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool night air rush in, and cranked up the radio to some static-filled classic rock station. It felt good, like shaking off a heavy coat you didn't realize you'd been wearing. I didn't have a plan for where I was going. I just drove, letting the city melt away behind me, the familiar streets blurring into backroads and open fields. The watch ticked softly on my wrist, even though I knew it wasn't actually working, and it felt like my dad was riding shotgun, silently keeping me company the way he used to when I was a kid. At some point, I found myself on the road that led to the lake. The lake had been our spot, not just mine and his, our whole family. We'd spend summers out there, swimming until our fingers wrinkled, grilling burgers on a cheap charcoal grill, and watching the sun dip low over the water. It was the kind of place that felt endless when you were a kid, like summer would stretch on forever, as long as you stayed by the shore. But we hadn't been back since the year Mom left. After that, it was like the lake stopped existing for us, just one more thing we couldn't hold on to. I pulled into the old parking lot, the one half hidden by trees, and killed the engine. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, vast and still, like it was waiting for me to say something. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and walked down to the water's edge. I stood there for a long time, watching the ripples spread across the surface, each one fading into the next until they disappeared completely. It felt like standing inside a memory I didn't know I still had. I sat down on the damp grass, legs stretched out in front of me, and ran my fingers over the watch face again. "Miss you, old man," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It wasn't the first time I'd said it, but it was the first time I meant it. We didn't have the easiest relationship, me and him. He was quiet, old school, the kind of guy who didn't know how to say things like "I love you" or "I'm proud of you" without making it sound like an afterthought. But he showed up, always, and that counted for something. I sat there, feeling the weight of all the things I never said to him when I had the chance. The apologies I owed him, the thank yous I never gave. I thought about how much time we waste waiting for the right moment to say the things that matter, like we think we have all the time in the world, until suddenly we don't. I don't know how long I stayed at the lake. Long enough for the moon to shift in the sky. Long enough for the cold to settle into my bones. When I finally stood up, my legs were stiff and my hands felt numb. I gave the lake one last look, as if to say goodbye to something I didn't know I'd been holding on to, and walked back to the car. The drive home was quieter. No music this time, just the soft hum of the engine and the tick of the broken watch against my wrist. When I got back to my apartment, I set the watch on the nightstand, next to the stack of books I kept meaning to read but never did. I stared at it for a moment, the cracked glass catching the glow of the streetlights outside. Then, without really thinking about it, I grabbed my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled down until I found my mom's name, the one I hadn't dialed in years, and hovered my thumb over the call button. For a moment, I thought about all the reasons not to call. The hurt, the silence, the years spent pretending we didn't miss each other. And then I pressed call. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hello," she answered, her voice groggy but familiar, like the sound of a song I hadn't heard in a long time. "Hey, Mom," I said softly. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that carries more weight than words. "Hey," she whispered back. And just like that, something in me shifted, something I didn't even know I'd been waiting to let go of. I lay back in bed, the watch ticking softly on the nightstand, even though I knew it was still broken. And for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Not perfect, not fixed, but steady. And maybe, I thought as I closed my eyes, that was enough. We met at a friend's housewarming party. One of those casual, cozy gatherings where everyone brings wine, the playlist is just a little too loud, and people end up sitting on the floor because there aren't enough chairs. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone. Honestly, I was just there out of obligation, ready to make a polite appearance, sip my drink, and leave early. But then he sat down next to me. He had this warm, open energy, the kind of person who makes you feel comfortable without even trying. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said with a grin. I laughed, surprised at how easily he'd seen through me. "Busted," I said. "What gave it away?" "The way you keep checking the time on your phone like you're plotting your escape," he teased. And just like that, we were off talking, joking, and sinking into the kind of conversation that makes hours disappear without notice. By the end of the night, it felt like the party had faded into the background. It was just us, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sharing stories and finishing the last of the wine. When he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, I said yes without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. I just wanted to see where this would go. Our first date was perfect. One of those crisp fall afternoons where everything feels just a little more magical. Orange leaves on the ground, sweater weather, and the smell of coffee in the air. We wandered through a park after getting lattes, talking about everything from favorite childhood books to the worst movies we'd ever seen. He had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what people mean when they talk about meeting someone who just feels right. The next few months felt like something out of a dream. He wasn't just kind, he was consistent, thoughtful. He'd show up with my favorite snacks, leave sweet notes on my bathroom mirror, and text me good morning without fail. He made me feel safe in a way that felt almost foreign after years of disappointments. I started to believe, really believe, that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally found someone I didn't have to guard my heart against. But as the months went on, the cracks started to show. Little things at first, plans rescheduled, texts that came slower, moments where he seemed distant. I tried to tell myself it was normal. No one can sustain that honeymoon phase energy forever, right? People get busy, life happens. But it wasn't just that. It felt like something had shifted between us. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the space between us kept growing. One night, we were supposed to have dinner at my place. I spent the whole day looking forward to it. Made his favorite dish, lit a candle, even put on the playlist we used to listen to when we first started dating. But an hour before he was supposed to arrive, I got the dreaded text. "Sorry, can't make it tonight. Work stuff." Rain check. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, feeling that familiar pit of disappointment settle in my chest. It wasn't just about the cancel plans. It was the way he said it, like it didn't even matter. Like I was something he could reschedule when it was convenient for him. The next time we saw each other, I tried to bring it up gently to ask if everything was okay between us. "You seem distant," I said, carefully choosing my words. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he said. "I guess I've just got a lot on my mind lately." I nodded, pretending that was enough. But deep down, I knew that when someone starts pulling away like that, it's rarely about work or stress. It's about them realizing they don't want what you thought you were building together. And no amount of understanding or patience can fix that. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us only grew. Texts became sporadic, plans felt half-hearted, and conversations that used to flow so easily now felt strained and awkward. I kept telling myself to hold on a little longer, that maybe it was just a rough patch. But one night, after another canceled date and another vague excuse, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I texted him, "Can we talk? I need to know where we stand." He responded a few minutes later, "Yeah, of course. I'll call you tomorrow." Tomorrow came and went, and the call never came. That was the moment it hit me. The quiet truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. He was already gone. He just hadn't bothered to say goodbye. I cried that night. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet, exhausted kind. The kind that comes from realizing you gave someone your heart, and they didn't even notice when they dropped it. It wasn't the first time I'd been hurt, but somehow it felt different. He hadn't ghosted me in the traditional sense, but emotionally, he'd been fading away for weeks, slipping through my fingers without a word. And that kind of disappearance hurts in a way that's hard to explain. In the days that followed, I tried to make peace with it. I deleted his number, unfollowed him on social media, and told myself it was better this way. Better to know now than to drag it out any longer. But the thing about heartbreak is that it never really leaves you. It lingers, sneaking up on you in quiet moments when you least expect it. I'd see something that reminded me of him, a song we used to listen to, a place we went together, and it would hit me all over again. I kept wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd been too much or not enough, if there was some version of myself that would have made him stay. But the truth is, people leave, sometimes for reasons they can't explain, and sometimes for no reason at all. And you can't hold on to someone who's already decided to let go. It's been a few months now, and I'm still learning how to live with the silence he left behind. Some days are better than others. Some days I feel like I'm finally okay, like I've moved on and made peace with it. But other days it still stings, and I think that's okay. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But here's the thing, I'm still here. I'm still trying. Because as much as it hurts to lose someone, it hurts even more to lose yourself trying to hold on to them. And I refuse to do that ever again. I don't know when or if I'll meet someone new. But for now, I'm learning how to be okay on my own, learning that I'm enough, even without someone else to validate me. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most important lesson of all. So, I'll keep going, one day at a time, one breath at a time. And if love finds me again, I'll be ready. But this time, I'll make sure I'm standing on solid ground, whether they stay or not. About 5 years ago, I was driving across state lines for a job interview. It was a long haul, 8 hours through flat highways and quiet back roads, cutting through stretches of farmland and forests. I didn't mind, though. I love night drives. There's something calming about the hum of the engine and the empty roads, where it feels like the whole world is asleep except for you. I left late in the afternoon, figuring I'd get to the motel around midnight, crash for a few hours, and still have time to prep in the morning. The first few hours were smooth, just me, my playlist, and the occasional trucker passing by. But somewhere around hour 6, things took a turn. The GPS told me to take an exit off the highway onto a smaller road that cut through a forest. It seemed like a shortcut, so I followed it without much thought. The road was narrow, 2 lanes with no streetlights, just trees pressing in on both sides. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The only light came from my high beams, cutting through the thick blackness ahead. About 10 minutes in, that's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was just a pale shape at the edge of the forest, barely visible. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person, a woman. She was barefoot, wearing a thin white dress that looked almost gray in my headlights. Her long hair hung limp and tangled over her shoulders, and her skin was so pale it almost glowed in the dark. But what hit me hardest was how she was standing, completely still, facing the road, arms hanging limp by her sides like she'd been waiting there for me. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. I mean, what the hell was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she'd been in an accident. But something in my gut told me not to stop. As I drove past her, I glanced over, just for a second. She was watching me. Her head turned slowly as I passed, her eyes locking onto mine through the window. There was no expression on her face, no fear, no sadness, no anger. Just nothing. I felt cold all over, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, so I did. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and I pressed the gas, speeding deeper into the forest. For a few minutes, I thought that was it. Just a weird encounter with a lost woman. Something I'd laugh about later. But then I looked in the rearview mirror, and she was there, not on the side of the road, in the back seat. I almost lost control of the car. My heart stopped, my hands jerking the wheel. For a second, I swore I saw her sitting in the shadows, her pale face just visible in the dim light from the dashboard. But when I whipped my head around to look, the back seat was empty. I laughed, a shaky, panicked laugh that didn't feel right coming out of my mouth. "You're losing it," I muttered to myself, trying to calm down. "You're just tired. That's all." I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, waiting for her to reappear. But there was nothing, just the empty back seat, lit by the occasional glow of passing trees. I thought I was in the clear until my GPS glitched. The screen flickered once, then twice, and suddenly the route recalculated. Rerouting, it said in that calm, robotic voice. I glanced down, confused. The GPS had reset itself, showing a new route that took me off the main road and deeper into the forest. Nope, I muttered, reaching over to tap it, but the screen wouldn't respond. It just kept showing the same new route, insisting that I take the next left onto some unmarked road. And that's when the car stalled. Just like that. The engine cut out, the dashboard went dark, and the car coasted to a slow, agonizing stop in the middle of the forest. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in my chest, and twisted the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again, and again. The engine refused to turn over. It was dead. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of someone watching me. Not from behind this time, but from beside the car. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. But some awful curiosity forced my head to turn, inch by inch, until I was staring out the driver's side window. She was there. The woman was standing just inches from the glass, her face level with mine, her eyes wide and unblinking. She smiled this awful, slow smile, her lips stretching too far across her face, like she was peeling back her skin. I screamed. I don't remember making the sound. It just ripped out of me, raw and desperate. I scrambled for the door handle, but before I could open it, she pressed her hand against the glass. Her handprint, it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were too long, the shape all wrong, like they'd been stretched and twisted. And when she pressed down, the glass groaned under the pressure, spiderweb cracks spreading from her palm. I don't know how I did it. Maybe pure terror gives you strength, but I jammed the key into the ignition one last time, and somehow, the engine roared to life. I slammed the car into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I tore down the road. The GS was still glitching, the voice endlessly repeating, rerouting, but I didn't care. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, taking turns blindly, just trying to get the hell out of those woods. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw the faint glow of streetlights up ahead. I hit the main road, heart hammering, and kept driving until I found a gas station. I pulled into the lot, breathing hard, and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm down. I kept expecting to see her standing outside the window again, smiling that awful smile. But the lot was empty, just rows of pumps under flickering lights. When I finally got the nerve to look at the window where she'd pressed her hand, I expected to see nothing. A smudge, maybe something I could laugh off as a weird dream. But the handprint was still there. Stretched, warped, wrong. I scrubbed at it with my sleeve, but it wouldn't come off. It's like it had been burned into the glass. I made it to my interview the next morning, running on fumes and adrenaline. I didn't tell anyone what happened on the way there. They'd think I was insane. Hell, I still feel insane just thinking about it. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. A few days after I got back home, I found that handprint again. Not on the car this time. It was on the inside of my bedroom window. This one is known among my classmates as the substitute wrestling match. It wasn't supposed to happen. In fact, the entire day was supposed to be a free period. But one thing led to another, and before we knew it, half the school was chanting, body slam, while a substitute teacher squared off against a varsity wrestler in the middle of the gym. Here's how it all went down. Our gym teacher, Coach Roberts, had called in sick that day, probably hungover if we're being honest. In his place, the school sent in Mr. Duffy, a substitute we'd never seen before. Now, most subs have one of two strategies. Either act like they run the place, or sit quietly and pray for the bell to ring. Mr. Duffy chose a third option, chaos. The guy looked like a cross between a retired frat bro and someone who'd been living out of his car for the past month. He was wearing a windbreaker from the 90s, a pair of sneakers that had definitely seen better days, and sunglasses. Inside, he strutted into the gym like he was about to coach the Super Bowl. "All right, listen up, kids," Duffy said, blowing a whistle he brought from home. "We're gonna have some fun today. None of that boring dodgeball crap." He paused, scanning the bleachers like he was building suspense. "How many of you know how to wrestle?" The gym went dead quiet. Now, here's the thing. This wasn't a random question. Our school was known for its wrestling team, and sitting front and center was Eddie Jones, the captain of the varsity wrestling team and a two-time state champ. Eddie was built like a tank and had this permanent "don't mess with me" expression. Eddie raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly, but stayed quiet. Mr. Duffy, apparently unaware of who Eddie was, grinned and said, "What, no takers? Y'all scared to tussle a little? What happened to the spirit of competition?" That's when Eddie leaned back on the bleachers and, in the most casual voice ever, said, "I'll wrestle you." The gym exploded. Kids were laughing, cheering, already sensing that something absolutely ridiculous was about to happen. A teacher wrestling a student? This was the kind of thing legends are made of. Mr. Duffy didn't even hesitate. "All right, tough guy," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's do this." Eddie, to his credit, looked amused but not particularly worried. I mean, the guy had taken down state-level opponents. How hard could it be to pin some washed-up substitute? The next thing we knew, Mr. Duffy had stripped off his windbreaker, revealing a faded gold gym tank top underneath. He kicked off his sneakers, did a couple of stretches that looked more like dance moves, and shouted, "Clear the mats! It's go time!" At this point, there were no adults around to stop what was happening. I think the gym staff had wandered off to the teacher's lounge, assuming we were all playing basketball or whatever. No one was prepared for what was about to go down. We formed a circle around the wrestling mat like it was some kind of underground fight club. Eddie stepped onto the mat, looking calm and collected, while Mr. Duffy bounced on his toes like a boxer preparing for a title match. "Rules?" Eddie asked, more as a joke than anything. "No rules," Duffy said, grinning wildly. "Just pain." And with that, the match began. At first, it looked like Eddie was going to end it in 5 seconds flat. He grabbed Duffy's arm, spun him around, and went for a quick takedown. But somehow, against all logic, Duffy dodged. He slipped out of Eddie's grip with the agility of a man possessed and tackled him around the waist. The gym went nuts. Kids were screaming, stomping their feet, chanting, "Duffy! Duffy! Duffy!" like we were watching the WWE. For the next 30 seconds, the match became a chaotic blur. Eddie kept trying to pin Duffy, but every time he got close, the sub would wiggle out of his grasp like a slippery eel. At one point, Duffy straight up did a somersault to escape a headlock. A freaking somersault. "Is he good at this?" Someone whispered next to me. "Dude, I think he's insane," I whispered back. Then it happened, the moment we all still talk about to this day. Duffy, somehow still standing, grabbed Eddie by the waist, lifted him off the ground, and slammed him onto the mat with a move that can only be described as a combination of a suplex and sheer madness. Thud! The gym went absolutely feral. People were shouting, throwing water bottles in the air, banging on the bleachers like they were at a rock concert. Someone started chanting, "Body slam, body slam," and within seconds, the entire gym joined in. Eddie lay there on the mat, stunned, not hurt, just confused, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Mr. Duffy stood over him, breathing heavily, arms raised in victory, as if he'd just won an Olympic gold medal. "You see that?" Duffy yelled, spinning in circles. "I still got it." We were losing our minds. This wasn't just a substitute teacher wrestling a student. This was a moment. The kind of thing that gets passed down from class to class, growing more ridiculous with each retelling. Of course, the celebration didn't last long. Right as Mr. Duffy was basking in his glory, the gym door slammed open, and in walked Principal Swanson. The room fell silent in an instant. The principal took one look at the scene. The torn-up mat, Eddie lying flat on his back, Mr. Duffy standing victorious, and just blinked. "What," she said slowly, "is going on here?" No one knew what to say. Mr. Duffy, still riding the high of his victory, gave her a salute and said, "Just teaching these kids about competition, ma'am." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the gym, muttering, "I need a vacation." The second the door closed behind her, the gym erupted again. People were hugging, high-fiving, and chanting Duffy's name like he was a conquering hero. Even Eddie, still lying on the mat, started laughing. As for Mr. Duffy, he pulled his windbreaker back on, grabbed his shoes, and walked off the mat like a man with no regrets. "I'll see y'all next time," he called over his shoulder. "Stay in school." And just like that, he was gone. We never saw Mr. Duffy again. He vanished into the ether, leaving behind nothing but a memory and a legacy. To this day, no one knows where the school found him or where he went after that. But every time field day rolls around, someone brings up the wrestling match. And every time, without fail, someone says, "Man, remember Duffy?" Yeah, we remember.